Montana Territory, 1871. The winter stretched across the plains like a shroud burying fences and deadening sound beneath its weight. On this night, the moon hung behind racing clouds, casting brief spectral light over an endless sea of white. A gunshot cracked the silence. Margaret Maggie Sinclair stumbled through knee-deep snow, her breath coming in ragged clouds before her face. Her arms ached from clutching her daughter Hannah to her chest, the child's small body trembling against her own. Behind them, lantern lights bobbed in the darkness, distant, yet but persistent as wolves on a scent. "Mama," Hannah whispered, her voice muffled against Maggie's frost-stiffened shawl. "They're still coming." Maggie didn't waste breath on a response. Each step was a battle against the drifts that seemed determined to pull her down. Her thoughts fractured between prayer and calculation, how much farther she could go, how much longer the child could last in this cold. Another gunshot split the night closer this time, a warning not aimed to hit. They wanted her alive. A hacking cough racked Hannah's small frame, and Maggie's heart clenched with fear sharper than the cold. The fever that had begun that morning was worsening. Through the swirling snow she caught a flicker of yellow light, steady, not moving like the lanterns of their pursuers. A cabin. Hope and desperation surged through her exhausted body. With renewed strength she pushed forward, fixing her gaze on that distant promise of shelter. The wind clawed at them as if determined to keep her from reaching it, but Maggie pressed on one agonizing step after another. As they drew closer, the cabin took shape, sturdy logs, chinked with mud, a stone chimney releasing thin wisps of smoke into the night sky. A single window glowed with firelight, a beacon in the wilderness. Maggie reached the rough-hewn door, her knuckles hovering for a moment. Pride had been stripped from her months ago, but still, this last surrender was difficult. For Hannah's sake, she swallowed what remained of her dignity and knocked. The sound was small against the howling wind. She knocked again, harder, desperation lending strength to her frozen fingers. A shuffling sound came from within, followed by the scrape of a bolt being drawn back. The door swung open. A tall man filled the doorframe, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the warm glow behind him. In one hand, he held a rifle, its barrel lowered but ready. The firelight caught the planes of his face, weathered, bearded with eyes the color of winter sky. Those eyes narrowed as they took in Maggie's face. "You're Conrad Sinclair's wife," he said, his voice a rough baritone. It wasn't a question. "Half the territory's looking for you." Maggie's heart sank, but she lifted her chin, meeting his gaze directly. "My daughter is sick," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "We need shelter, just for tonight." The man's gaze shifted to Hannah, whose face was flushed with fever despite the cold. For a long moment he said nothing, and Maggie braced herself for rejection. But then his eyes returned to hers, searching, assessing. "You're running from the law," he stated flatly. "I'm running from men who call themselves the law." Maggie corrected, a flash of defiance warming her despite the cold. "There's a difference." Another gunshot echoed in the distance, causing Hannah to whimper. The man's head turned sharply toward the sound, then back to Maggie. Something shifted in his expression, not softening exactly, but a decision made. He stepped aside. "Get in," he said gruffly, "and stay away from the windows." Maggie didn't need to be told twice. She hurried past him into the blessed warmth of the cabin, clutching Hannah tighter as the heat struck her frozen face like a physical blow. Behind her, the man closed the door and slid the heavy wooden bolt into place. The interior was simple but orderly. A fire crackled in a stone hearth, casting dancing shadows across log walls hung with tools and dried herbs. A wooden table with 2 chairs stood in one corner, a narrow bed in another. Shelves lined one wall filled with books and glass jars. The space smelled of pine wood smoke and something medicinal. "Put her by the fire," the man instructed, moving past Maggie to place his rifle on a rack near the door. He walked with an uneven gait, favoring his left leg. Maggie lowered Hannah onto a worn rug before the hearth. The child's eyes were glassy with fever, her small face flushed. As Maggie removed her daughter's frozen outer garments, she became acutely aware of the man watching them from across the room. "Thank you," she said without looking up. "We won't trouble you long." "You already have," he replied bluntly. "Come morning, I'm taking you to town." Maggie's hands stilled on Hannah's bootlaces. "They'll hang me. That's the law's concern, not mine." "It's not the law that's after me," Maggie said quietly, finally looking up at him. "It's men who profit from making their own justice." Something flickered in the man's expression, not quite belief, but perhaps a willingness to listen. He crossed to a cupboard and took out a tin cup, then filled it with water from a kettle warming by the fire. Without comment, he handed it to Maggie. "The child has fever," he observed. Maggie nodded, helping Hannah drink. "It started this morning. Then they came, and we had to run." The man frowned, studying Hannah with a professional intensity that struck Maggie as unusual for a mountain recluse. "How high?" "High enough to worry," Maggie admitted. "She was delirious before we reached your door." Without asking permission, the man knelt beside them, his movements surprisingly gentle despite his size. He placed a calloused hand on Hannah's forehead, then checked her pulse at the wrist. Hannah looked up at him with wide, fever-bright eyes. "Are you an angel?" she asked in a small voice. "Mama said angels have silver stars." A strange expression crossed the man's face, pain perhaps, or memory. "No," he said gruffly. "I'm no angel." He rose awkwardly, leaning heavily on his right leg, and moved to a small curtained alcove at the back of the cabin. Maggie heard the clink of glass and metal. When he returned, he carried a small wooden box. "She needs willow bark tea for the fever," he said, opening the box to reveal neatly organized vials and packets. "And I'll need to listen to her chest. That cough concerns me." Maggie stared at him, sudden understanding dawning. "You're a doctor." The man's face hardened. "I was," he corrected. "Now I'm just a man who wants to be left alone." He selected a packet from his box and moved to prepare the tea. "What's her name?" "Hannah," Maggie replied, stroking her daughter's damp hair. "And I'm Maggie. Sinclair, as you already know." "Thaddeus Remington," he said without turning. "Most call me Thad." Outside, the wind howled louder, rattling the window frames. The lantern lights that had followed them were no longer visible through the driving snow. For the moment, at least, they were safe. But as Hannah's cough deepened, and Thad moved with quiet efficiency to prepare remedies, Maggie knew their troubles were far from over. Dawn would bring decisions and dangers that even this temporary shelter couldn't hold at bay. Thad Remington had developed a soldier's instinct for sensing danger long before he'd lost half his left leg at the Wilderness. As he prepared willow bark tea for the feverish child, that instinct hummed like a plucked wire. The woman, Maggie Sinclair, was trouble of the most complicated kind. Everyone in 3 counties knew the story, or thought they did. Conrad Sinclair, wealthy merchant and investor in the Northern Pacific Railroad, found dead at the bottom of his staircase 18 months ago, his young wife missing along with a substantial amount of money. Some claimed she'd pushed him in a fit of greed. Others whispered that she'd endured years of abuse before finally snapping. Thad had no interest in other people's dramas. After the war, after the trial, he'd retreated to this cabin with its blessed solitude. Here, the only judgments he faced were from the Wilderness and his own conscience, both harsh enough without adding human complications. Yet here she was, Conrad Sinclair's widow. Her eyes, a clear, challenging green in a face drawn with exhaustion. And with her, a child burning with fever. "She'll need to drink all of this," Thad said, returning to the fireside with the steaming cup. "It's bitter, but it will help bring the fever down." Maggie nodded, cradling Hannah's head as Thad held the cup to the child's cracked lips. Hannah grimaced at the taste, but drank obediently, her trust in her mother evident in every movement. When she'd finished, Thad set the cup aside and took a wooden stethoscope from his medical box. "I need to listen to her lungs," he explained, his tone professional. "Fever, with that kind of cough, could mean pneumonia." "You do seem well equipped for someone who isn't a doctor anymore," Maggie observed quietly. Thad's mouth tightened. "Old habits," he said shortly. Then to Hannah, "I'm going to listen to your chest, little one. Like a seashell, but backwards I hear the ocean inside you." This gentle approach, so at odds with his gruff manner toward Maggie, seemed to work. Hannah smiled weakly and allowed him to place the stethoscope against her chest. Thad listened intently, his expression revealing nothing. But Maggie, watching closely, saw the slight relaxation in his shoulders. "Not pneumonia," he pronounced finally. "Not yet, anyway. A bad cold, possibly influenza. She needs rest, fluids, and warmth." He hesitated, then added reluctantly, "She shouldn't be moved for at least a few days." Relief and apprehension warred in Maggie's expression. "You said you'd take us to town in the morning." "That was before I examined her." Thad repacked his stethoscope with methodical care. "I may not practice medicine officially anymore, but I won't risk a child's life." Something in his tone caught Maggie's attention. "Why did you stop practicing medicine, I mean?" Thad's face closed like a shutter. "That's not a story for tonight." He stood using the mantelpiece to help him rise. In the firelight, Maggie noticed for the first time that his left trouser leg was pinned up neatly below the knee. As if sensing her gaze, Thad moved away, his gait uneven but practiced. "You'll take the bed," he said, nodding toward the narrow cot. "I'll sleep in the chair. Keep her close to you for warmth." "Thank you," Maggie said simply. Thad grunted in acknowledgement and busied himself banking the fire for the night. As he worked, Maggie gently carried Hannah to the bed, settling the drowsy child under the thick quilts. When she turned back, she found Thad watching them, an unreadable expression on his face. "Those men who were following you," he said quietly, "they'll come looking again at first light." "I know." Maggie's voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly as she tucked the quilt around Hannah. "Why are they really after you?" Maggie met his gaze directly. "Because I know things that could ruin powerful men. Because my husband wasn't just a merchant, he was involved in something terrible." She paused. "And because they think I have money that belongs to them." "And do you—" A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "No, but they'll never believe that." Thad considered her for a long moment. "Get some sleep," he said finally. "Tomorrow will come soon enough." As Maggie slipped under the quilts beside her daughter, Thad settled into the wooden chair by the fire, stretching his good leg toward the warmth. Outside, the storm raged on snow, piling against the window panes like nature's own fortification. In the flickering firelight, Thad studied the sleeping figures on his bed. The child's breathing was still labored, but the willow bark tea seemed to be helping. The woman, though exhausted, remained alert even in repose, one arm protectively around her daughter. Thad had seen that look before in the eyes of mothers in wartime, in soldiers protecting wounded comrades, in anyone who had found something worth dying for. It was a look that complicated his neat plan to simply wash his hands of this situation come morning. He shifted in the chair, the old pain in his missing limb flaring, as it always did in cold weather. The war had taken more than his leg. It had taken his faith in humanity and justice, in his own abilities as a healer. After the court-martial, after the accusations, he'd retreated here to this cabin, not just for solitude, but for safety, his own and others. A doctor who couldn't be trusted was a danger to everyone. Yet tonight, he'd fallen back into old patterns, without hesitation. The child had needed help, and his hands had remembered their purpose. Thad closed his eyes, but sleep remained elusive. In the darkness behind his eyelids, he saw again the field hospitals at Antietam, at Gettysburg, at the Wilderness, where he'd finally paid the price of his service. He heard the groans of the dying, smelled the gangrene and chloroform, felt the weight of lives dependent on his skill. And beneath it all, a face he tried daily to forget: Daniel Hayes, his closest friend, dying in his arms with a Silver Medical Corps star clutched in his bloody hand. "Promise me," Daniel had whispered, a promise Thad had failed to keep. He opened his eyes, forcing the memories away. The cabin was quiet now, except for the crackling fire and the soft, congested breathing of the child. Tomorrow, he told himself firmly. Tomorrow, he would send them on their way back to whatever troubles they had brought with them. His days of saving people were long past. But even as he thought it, Thad knew he was lying to himself. For the first time in years, he had opened his door to another human being's suffering. And once opened, such doors were not easily closed again. Dawn broke with deceptive gentleness, pale light seeping through frost-covered windows. Thad had been awake for hours, his sleep broken by phantom pains and old nightmares. He'd slipped out once to check his snare lines, returning with 2 rabbits for the cooking pot. Now he worked silently at the table, skinning the game with practiced efficiency. From the bed came a soft moan. Hannah's fever had risen during the night, despite the willow bark tea. Twice Thad had risen to place cool cloths on her forehead, moving with the quiet competence of one long accustomed to tending the sick. Each time Maggie had awakened instantly, her eyes tracking his movements with wary gratitude. Now she sat up, careful not to disturb Hannah. In the gray morning light, her face looked drawn, the angles of her cheekbones more pronounced, dark circles beneath her eyes, testifying to a night of broken sleep. "How is she?" Thad asked without looking up from his work. "The fever's still high," Maggie replied, placing a hand on Hannah's forehead. She was talking in her sleep about stars and angels. Thad nodded, his knife moving steadily. "I'll make a stronger tea, and a broth from these rabbits will help keep her strength up." Maggie watched him work, noting the precision of his movements, the economy of effort that spoke of both military training and medical expertise. "You're very skilled for someone living alone in the wilderness." A muscle tightened in Thad's jaw, but he continued his work without pause. "I wasn't always alone." The simplicity of the statement hung in the air between them, laden with unspoken history. Maggie recognized the boundaries of a pain too private to share, and did not press further. Instead, she rose and moved to the wash basin, splashing cold water on her face. "The men who were following us," she said quietly. "Sheriff Parker and his deputies. They'll be searching when the storm clears." "It's already clearing," Thad confirmed. "I checked the tracks around the cabin. The snow's stopped, and the wind's dying down." He glanced up at her. "They'll be able to follow your trail here by midday." Maggie's shoulders tensed, but she nodded, accepting this reality. "Then we should be gone before then." "Your daughter can't travel," Thad reminded her bluntly. "Not in her condition. We can't stay here. I won't bring trouble to your door after you've helped us." Thad set down his knife and studied her. "It seems trouble follows you regardless of your intentions, Mrs. Sinclair." Something flashed in Maggie's eyes, pride perhaps, or defiance. "I've had my share of it, yes, but I didn't create it." "Most people don't," Thad said dryly. "They just inherit it like bad debt or weak lungs." He resumed his work, adding almost casually, "Why don't you tell me what really happened to your husband?" The question hung in the air, sharp as the knife in his hand. Maggie moved to the fire, her back to him, shoulders straight despite her exhaustion. "Why should I?" she asked quietly. "You've already decided to turn us over to Parker." "I said I'd take you to town," Thad corrected. "I never specified who I'd hand you to." Maggie turned to face him, surprise evident in her expression. "You believe me, that Parker isn't acting in the name of justice?" "I believe very little on face value, Mrs. Sinclair." Thad set the cleaned rabbits aside and wiped his hands on a cloth. "But I've been in Clearwater long enough to know that Sheriff Parker's interests extend beyond upholding the law. And I've lived long enough to know that official stories often leave out the most important truths." He gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit. Eat something. Then tell me your version of events. I'll decide what I believe afterward." Maggie hesitated, then moved to the table. Thad placed a plate before her, cornbread left from the previous day and a cup of strong black coffee. She ate mechanically, her gaze frequently returning to Hannah's sleeping form. "Conrad was charming when we met," she began finally, her voice low. "The son of a successful Boston merchant, educated, ambitious. I was teaching at a small school, the daughter of a blacksmith and a schoolteacher, both dead by then. Conrad offered security, respectability." A bitter smile touched her lips. "And he seemed kind. That mattered more than the rest." She sipped her coffee, gathering her thoughts. "The first 2 years were good. We moved here for the railroad business. Conrad had investments connections, but things changed. He began drinking heavily, staying out late. There were rumors about other women, but that wasn't what truly concerned me." "What did?" Thad prompted when she fell silent. "Money," Maggie said simply. "Large sums appearing and disappearing from his accounts. Men visiting at strange hours, Parker among them. Conversations that stopped when I entered a room." She set down her cup. "And then the women began disappearing." Thad's eyebrows rose slightly. "Women?" Maggie nodded. "Young women, mostly immigrants, brought in to work for the railroad or as domestics. They would arrive, work briefly, then vanish. When I asked questions, Conrad became frightening." She pushed up her sleeve slightly, revealing faded bruises on her forearm. "He'd never been violent before, but something had changed in him, or perhaps it had always been there, hidden beneath the charm." Thad's expression remained neutral, but his eyes lingered on the bruises. "And the night he died?" Maggie's gaze dropped to her hands. "We argued. He'd been drinking heavily, raging about business problems. He threatened Hannah, said she wasn't even his, that he'd never wanted a child." Her voice caught. "He came at me, and I pushed him away. He fell down the stairs. And you didn't try to help him." "I did," Maggie whispered. "At first. But when I reached him, he was already gone. His neck." She swallowed hard. "And then I heard Parker at the front door. Conrad had sent for him earlier. I knew how it would look, the abused wife, the convenient accident. So I took Hannah and ran." Silence fell between them, broken only by the crackling fire and Hannah's labored breathing. Thad studied Maggie's face, searching for deception, but finding only exhaustion and a wariness born of long fear. "You didn't take the money they claim you stole?" he asked finally. "There was no money," Maggie said firmly. Conrad had been complaining for weeks that someone was stealing from him. Whatever he was involved in it was falling apart before he died. From the bed came a harsh, racking cough. Hannah was awake, her small face flushed with fever. Maggie rose immediately, going to her daughter's side. "Mama," Hannah whispered hoarsely, "I saw the angel again, with the silver star." "Shh, sweetheart," Maggie soothed, stroking damp hair from her daughter's forehead. "It was just a dream." Thad had risen too, moving to his medical box. "She needs more tea and something stronger for that cough," he said, his tone professional once more. But as he selected herbs and powders, his mind worked over Maggie's story, testing it for inconsistencies. The tale had the ring of truth, or at least a truth shaped by Maggie's perspective. Whether it was the whole truth remained to be seen. But one thing was increasingly clear: returning her to Sheriff Parker's custody would likely result in a hanging before the full story ever came to light. As Thad prepared the medicines, a sudden sound from outside froze him in place, the distinctive crack of breaking glass, followed by a dull thud against the cabin wall. Maggie's head snapped up, alarm widening her eyes. Thad moved swiftly to the window, staying to one side as he peered out. A rock lay on the floor, beneath the now broken pane, wrapped in a piece of paper. With a grim expression, he retrieved it, unwrapping the note. "What is it?" Maggie asked, her voice tense. Thad's mouth twisted as he read the crude message. "A reminder that not everyone in Clearwater has forgotten my past." He held up the paper for her to see the words scrawled in charcoal, "Murderer Doctor." Maggie frowned, confusion replacing fear. "Murderer you." Thad crumpled the note and tossed it into the fire. As I said, official stories often leave out important truths. He returned to preparing the medicine, his movements now sharp with suppressed anger. "It seems we both have histories that follow us, Mrs. Sinclair." Hannah coughed again, the sound deeper and more troubling. Thad brought the prepared tea to the bedside, his professional demeanor reasserting itself despite the interruption. As he helped the child drink, his fingers brushed her hair aside, revealing a small, distinctive scar behind her right ear. Thad froze, his eyes fixed on the scar. It was a surgical mark, the kind made by a very specific procedure, one he had performed only once in his career on a small girl during the war. A girl whose father had been his closest friend. "Is something wrong?" Maggie asked, noting his sudden stillness. Thad schooled his features to neutrality with effort. "No," he said, his voice carefully controlled. "Just checking for signs of measles. She's clear." But as he moved away from the bed, his mind raced with impossible possibilities. The scar, the child's age, her talk of angels with silver stars. It couldn't be coincidence. Yet the alternative seemed equally impossible. Unless Hannah Sinclair was not Hannah Sinclair at all, but Emma Hayes, the daughter of Daniel Hayes, entrusted to Thad's care in the chaotic aftermath of the wilderness, a trust he had failed to honor. And if that were true, then Maggie Sinclair had even more secrets than she was willing to share. The day settled into an uneasy rhythm. Thad moved between tasks, with military precision preparing rabbit stew, brewing more medicine for Hannah, mending the broken window with a piece of oiled paper. All the while his mind circled the impossible connection between the child in his bed and the promise he had failed to keep years ago. Maggie remained by Hannah's side, sponging her daughter's forehead with cool water, singing softly when the fever dreams became too distressing. Once, when Hannah finally drifted into a more peaceful sleep, Maggie joined Thad at the table where he was grinding herbs with a mortar and pestle. "You never told me why they call you a murderer," she said quietly. Thad's hands stilled momentarily, then resumed their rhythmic work. "Because men died under my care," he said simply. "Men die under every doctor's care," Maggie countered. "Especially in war." Thad's mouth tightened. These were different. 23 men all in one field hospital after the Wilderness. Fever, sepsis, rapid decline. They called it Remington's Plague because it only affected my patients. The bitterness in his voice was palpable. "A court-martial cleared me officially. The water supply had been contaminated upstream by decomposing bodies. But by then, the damage was done." "And so you came here," Maggie concluded, "to punish yourself for something that wasn't your fault." Thad looked up sharply. "I came here because I was no longer fit to practice medicine. Because, despite the official finding, I will never know if I could have saved those men had I been more vigilant, more skilled." "And the leg?" Maggie asked softly. "Was that punishment too?" A ghost of a smile touched Thad's lips. "No, that was just war. A Confederate sharpshooter at the Wilderness. I was tending a wounded captain when the bullet found me." He resumed grinding the herbs. "I was lucky the surgeon who took it off knew his business. Many weren't so fortunate." Maggie watched his hands work strong and capable, despite everything they had endured. "You're still a doctor," she observed, "whether you practice officially or not. It's in how you move, how you think, how you look at Hannah." Thad did not respond directly to this insight. Instead, he changed the subject. "Your daughter's fever is stubborn. The medicines should have shown more effect by now." "She's always been sensitive to illness," Maggie said, accepting the shift, "even as an infant." "How old was she when you adopted her?" The question hung in the air, precise as a surgeon's cut. Maggie's eyes widened slightly, then narrowed. "What makes you think she's adopted?" Thad met her gaze steadily. "The surgical scar behind her right ear. It's distinctive a procedure to drain fluid after a head injury. Very few surgeons knew how to perform it during the war." He paused. "I was one of them." Maggie's face paled, but she held his gaze. "Hannah is my daughter in every way that matters," she said, her voice low but firm. "Conrad and I couldn't have children. We adopted her when she was 2. "From where?" "An agency in Chicago. They said she was an orphan from the war." Maggie's hands clasped tightly on the table. "Conrad wanted a son, but when we saw Hannah, I knew she was meant to be ours." Her voice softened. "She was so small, so solemn, but when she smiled, it was like the sun coming out." Thad's expression remained unreadable, but his mind worked rapidly, assembling pieces of a puzzle too coincidental to ignore. "This agency, did they tell you anything about her background? Her parents?" Maggie shook her head. "Very little. Only that her father had been a Union officer killed at the Wilderness, and her mother had died in childbirth. They didn't even know her original name." She studied Thad's face intently. "Why are you asking these questions? Do you know something about Hannah?" Before Thad could answer, a violent coughing fit from the bed drew their attention. Hannah was awake again, her face alarmingly flushed. Maggie hurried to her side while Thad gathered the prepared medicine. "The fever's worse," Maggie said anxiously as Thad joined her. "And her breathing." Thad checked Hannah's pulse, his face grim. "The infection is moving deeper into her chest. She needs stronger medicine than I have here." He made a swift decision. "I'll need to go to town." "Town!" Maggie's voice rose in alarm. "But Parker, we'll be looking for a woman and child, not a one-legged veteran," Thad finished. "I know what medicines to get, and I know how to move without attracting attention." He rose and moved to a chest in the corner, extracting a worn military greatcoat and a wide-brimmed hat. "I should be back by nightfall. Keep her warm, keep giving her the willow bark tea, and, if the fever spikes dangerously, use cool compresses on her wrists and neck." "What if someone comes while you're gone?" Maggie asked, fear evident in her voice. Thad hesitated, then crossed to the rifle rack. He selected a smaller weapon, a well-maintained revolver, and handed it to her. "Do you know how to use this?" Maggie took the gun with surprising confidence. "My father was a blacksmith who made firearms on the side. He taught me well." "Good," Thad nodded approvingly. "There's a cellar trap door under the rug by the pantry. If anyone comes, hide there with Hannah. Use this only if you have no choice." As Thad prepared to leave, gathering supplies and checking his prosthetic leg, Maggie touched his arm lightly. "Thank you," she said simply, "for risking this." Thad looked down at her hand on his sleeve, then up to her face. Something shifted in his expression, not quite softening, but a recognition, perhaps, of unexpected connection. "I'm not doing it for you," he said gruffly. "I'm doing it because a child needs help, and because I took an oath once that still means something despite everything." Maggie withdrew her hand, but held his gaze. "Even so, thank you." Thad nodded once, then stepped out into the bitter cold, pulling the door firmly shut behind him. The sky above was clear now, the storm having blown itself out overnight. In the pristine snow, the tracks leading to his cabin were still visible, a testament to Maggie and Hannah's desperate flight. With grim determination, Thad set out toward Clearwater, his mind occupied not only with the medicines Hannah needed, but with the impossible coincidence of her presence in his cabin. If she truly was Daniel Hayes's daughter, Emma, then fate had orchestrated a reunion Thad could never have engineered himself. And if she was Emma, then the promise he had failed to keep years ago had been given a second chance at fulfillment, a chance at redemption he had never expected to receive. The thought accompanied him as he made his way through the snow-laden forest, his gait uneven but purposeful. Behind him the cabin grew smaller, a solitary island of warmth in a sea of white. Within it, Maggie Sinclair kept watch over a child who might be the key to healing not just her own life, but Thad's as well. A child who spoke of angels with silver stars, the same silver star that Daniel Hayes had pressed into Thad's hand with his dying breath, along with a whispered plea, "Find Emma. Keep her safe." A promise Thad had failed to honor until now. As the day wore on, Maggie maintained a vigil by Hannah's bedside. The child drifted between restless sleep and feverish wakefulness, sometimes recognizing her mother, other times lost in delirium. "The angel is sad," Hannah murmured during one such episode, her small hands plucking at the quilt. "He lost his star, but I found it." "Shh, sweetheart," Maggie soothed, bathing Hannah's forehead with cool water. "Rest now." "The doctor has sad eyes," Hannah continued, her own eyes unfocused, like Daddy did before he went away. Maggie stilled her hand, hovering over her daughter's brow. Hannah rarely spoke of Conrad and never called him Daddy. It had always been father, formal and distant, as Conrad had preferred. This seemed like something else, something older. "What, Dr. Hannah?" she asked gently. "Do you mean Mr. Remington?" Hannah nodded drowsily. He fixed the star, but it broke again. Her eyes fluttered closed. "Don't be sad, Mama. Angels watch over sad people." Maggie resumed bathing Hannah's hot skin, her mind troubled by these fever dreams and by Thad's pointed questions about Hannah's adoption. The surgical scar, she had always assumed it was from an accident in Hannah's early life. But Thad's recognition of it, his apparent knowledge of its origin, suggested connections she couldn't begin to unravel. The hours passed slowly. Maggie tended the fire, prepared more tea from Thad's supplies, and kept watch at the windows for any sign of pursuers. Twice she thought she heard sounds outside that sent her heart racing, but each time proved to be only the wind or settling snow falling from tree branches. As the afternoon waned and shadows lengthened across the cabin floor, Hannah's fever seemed to ease slightly. Her breathing remained labored, but the violent coughing fits came less frequently. Exhausted, Maggie allowed herself to doze in the chair beside the bed, one hand resting protectively on her daughter's arm. She woke with a start to the sound of approaching footsteps crunching through snow. Daylight had faded to dusk, and for a moment, disoriented from sleep, Maggie couldn't place where she was. Then memory flooded back along with fear. Moving swiftly, she checked Hannah, still sleeping, still feverish but stable, then retrieved the revolver from where she'd kept it close at hand. The footsteps grew louder, accompanied by the distinctive uneven gait she now recognized as Thad's. Relief washed through her, but caution kept the gun ready until a familiar knock sounded at the door. "It's Remington," came Thad's voice, low and urgent. Maggie hurried to unbolt the door. Thad entered quickly, stamping snow from his boots, his face red with cold. He carried a small burlap sack, which he immediately brought to the table. "How is she?" he asked without preamble, unwrapping his scarf. "The fever's down slightly, but her breathing is still troubled," Maggie reported, setting the revolver aside. "How is town?" "Tense," Thad replied grimly. "Parker has men watching the roads. They're searching every farm and homestead within 10 miles. He began unpacking his sack, revealing glass vials and paper packets. "I got what we need, though. And information." He moved to Hannah's bedside, checking her pulse, and listening to her chest with his stethoscope. Satisfied with his examination, he returned to the table and began mixing powders in a cup. "What kind of information?" Maggie asked, watching his precise movements. "The kind that confirms your story, at least in part," Thad said, measuring drops from a small bottle into the mixture. "Parker's been asking questions about Conrad's business dealings, not just about you or the money. He seems particularly interested in a ledger." Maggie frowned. Conrad kept several ledgers, business records, investments. This one apparently contained names, destinations. Thad glanced up at her. "And it's missing." Understanding dawned in Maggie's eyes. "The women who disappeared," she whispered. "Conrad was keeping records." Thad nodded. "And Parker wants those records badly enough to put a bounty on your head." He finished preparing the medicine and brought it to Hannah's bedside. "Help me lift her head. She needs to drink all of this." Together, they roused Hannah enough to swallow the bitter mixture. The child grimaced, but complied, her trust in both adults evident despite her illness. When she had finished, Thad gently lowered her back to the pillow. "This should bring the fever down more effectively and ease her breathing," he explained. "We'll give her another dose before dawn." Maggie nodded gratefully. "Thank you for risking the trip to town." Thad didn't acknowledge the thanks directly. Instead, he moved to the fire and added another log, watching the flames leap higher. "While I was there, I asked some questions of my own," he said after a moment, "about adoption agencies in Chicago." Maggie tensed visibly. "Why would you do that?" "Because I believe your daughter may be someone I've been looking for," Thad said quietly, turning to face her. "Someone I promised to protect a long time ago and failed." "What are you talking about?" Thad's expression was solemn, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "During the Wilderness Campaign, I treated a Union captain named Daniel Hayes. He'd been wounded trying to reach his daughter, who'd been injured when their camp was shelled. The child had a serious head injury that required immediate surgery, the same procedure that left the scar behind Hannah's ear. Maggie sank slowly into a chair, her eyes never leaving Thad's face. "Go on," she whispered. Hayes knew he was dying. His last request was that I find his daughter Emma and keep her safe. Thad's voice grew rough with emotion. In the chaos after the battle with my own injury, I lost track of her. By the time I recovered enough to search, she had been evacuated with other orphans. I tried to find her for years, but the war scattered children like leaves in a storm. He moved to Hannah's bedside, looking down at the sleeping child. The timing fits. The scar is identical, and her fever dreams about angels with silver stars. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a tarnished silver medical corps insignia. Hayes pressed this into my hand before he died. He'd carried it as a good luck charm. Maggie stared at the star, then at her daughter's peaceful face. "I don't understand," she said finally. "Are you saying that Hannah is this Emma, this captain's daughter?" "I believe she may be," Thad said gently. "The coincidence would be too great otherwise." "But what does this mean?" Maggie's voice held a note of fear. "She's my daughter. I've raised her, loved her for 2 years." "I'm not trying to take her from you," Thad assured her quickly. "But if she is Emma Hayes, then perhaps it explains why our paths have crossed now against all odds." He hesitated, then added, "And it means I have a responsibility to both of you, a promise to keep, that goes beyond merely offering shelter for a night." Maggie's eyes filled with tears, whether of relief or new worry, Thad couldn't tell. "I can't lose her," she said simply. "She's all I have." "You won't lose her," Thad promised. "But we need to understand the truth, all of it, for her sake and for ours." Outside, darkness had fallen completely. The wind had picked up again, whistling around the cabin's eaves. Within, the fire crackled, casting dancing shadows across the walls. Hannah slept more peacefully now, the medicine beginning its work. Thad returned to the table and began preparing a simple meal from the provisions he'd brought from town. Maggie remained by the bed for a moment longer, then joined him, her movements slow with exhaustion. "I don't know what to believe anymore," she admitted as she helped him slice bread. "Everything I thought was certain has been taken away piece by piece." "Not everything," Thad countered, nodding toward Hannah. "She's still here, still yours in all the ways that matter." "And you?" Maggie asked, studying his face in the firelight. "What are you in all of this?" Thad considered the question, knife paused above the loaf. "I'm a man trying to keep a promise," he said finally. "A man who may have been given a second chance to do what's right." He resumed slicing. "For now, that means helping you both stay safe and getting Hannah well again. The rest, we'll face as it comes." They ate in companionable silence, the shared meal creating a sense of normalcy that belied the extraordinary circumstances of their meeting. Afterward, Thad checked Hannah again, noting with satisfaction that her breathing had eased and her fever had dropped further. "The medicine is working," he reported. "She should sleep through the night now." Maggie nodded gratefully. "I think I could sleep for a week myself," she admitted. "I can't remember the last time I closed my eyes without fear." Thad gestured to the bed. "Then sleep. I'll keep watch." "You need rest too," Maggie protested. "Your leg must pain you after the journey to town." "An old soldier's trick," Thad said with a faint smile. "I can sleep with one eye open. It's a habit that dies hard." Maggie hesitated, then nodded in acceptance. "Wake me if Hannah needs anything, or if—" She didn't finish the thought, but the implication was clear if danger came. "I will," Thad promised. As Maggie settled beside Hannah on the narrow bed, Thad took his place in the chair by the fire, his rifle across his knees. Outside, the wind continued to sing its lonely song, but within the cabin a fragile peace had settled, a temporary respite in the eye of a storm that neither of them could yet see the end of. For now, it was enough that they were safe, that Hannah was improving, and that in their shared concern for the child, they had found common purpose. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, its own revelations. But tonight, in the quiet warmth of the cabin, those troubles seemed distant, held at bay by firelight and newfound trust. Thad watched as Maggie's breathing deepened in sleep, her arm protectively around Hannah even in repose. The sight stirred something long dormant within him, a sense of responsibility, of connection to something beyond his own solitary existence. For years he had believed his purpose ended on the battlefield, his usefulness destroyed, along with his leg and reputation. Yet here he was, once again trusted with lives in his care. Once again a doctor, a protector, a keeper of promises. The realization was both terrifying and strangely comforting, like returning to a home long abandoned but still remembered in every detail. Whatever came next, whatever dangers Parker and his men represented, whatever truths remained to be uncovered about Hannah's identity, Thad knew he could no longer retreat into isolation. The door he had opened to Maggie and Hannah could not be closed again, not without losing something essential to his own humanity. With that thought, Thad settled deeper into his chair, adjusting his position to ease the phantom pain in his missing limb. The night stretched ahead long and uncertain, but for the first time in years, he faced it not with resignation, but with purpose. A purpose embodied in the sleeping child, who might be Emma Hayes, and in the woman who had braved a blizzard to save her. A week passed, each day falling into a rhythm both cautious and oddly domestic. Hannah's health improved steadily under Thad's care, her fever breaking on the third day, her cough gradually losing its worrisome depth. By the seventh morning, she was sitting up in bed, her appetite returned, her eyes bright with childish curiosity about everything in the cabin. "What's that?" she asked, pointing to a set of carved wooden animals lined on a shelf. Thad glanced up from where he was preparing breakfast. "Those, just some whittling I do in the evenings." "They're beautiful," Maggie said, genuinely impressed by the detail in the small figures, deer bears, wolves, each captured in lifelike motion. "You're quite talented." A hint of color touched Thad's weathered cheeks. "Keeps the hands busy, and the mind." Hannah's next question came with a child's directness. "Why do you walk funny?" "Hannah," Maggie admonished gently, "that's not polite." But Thad seemed untroubled by the question. He set 3 plates on the table and answered matter-of-factly, "I lost part of my leg in the war. Now I use a wooden one to help me walk." Hannah considered this with solemn attention. "Does it hurt?" "Sometimes," Thad admitted, "but not as much as it used to." "Mama says that's how hurts work," Hannah said wisely. "They get smaller if you're brave." Thad's eyes met Maggie's over the child's head, an unspoken understanding passing between them. They had both learned that some hurts never truly diminished. They were simply carried more skillfully with time. After breakfast, Thad announced his intention to go hunting. "Our supplies are running low," he explained, "and I should check if Parker's men are still searching the area." Maggie nodded, her expression betraying her concern. "Be careful." "Always am." Thad pulled on his coat and checked his rifle. "Stay inside. Keep the door bolted. I'll be back by midday." Once he had gone, Maggie and Hannah set about tidying the cabin. It was a task Maggie had taken on automatically since their arrival, a way of repaying Thad's reluctant hospitality. Today, with Hannah well enough to help, it became almost enjoyable, a normal domestic activity in what had been an extraordinary week. "I like it here," Hannah said suddenly, folding a small towel with careful attention. It's quiet like our house, before Father got angry all the time. Maggie paused in sweeping the floor, her heart aching at the simple observation. It is peaceful, she agreed softly. Can we stay? Hannah asked, looking up with hopeful eyes. Maggie set the broom aside and knelt before her daughter. This isn't our home, sweetheart. Mr. Remington has been very kind to let us stay while you were sick, but we can't impose on him forever. Where will we go? Hannah's lower lip trembled slightly. It was a question Maggie had been asking herself each night as she lay awake listening to Thad's even breathing from his chair by the fire. They couldn't return to Clearwater, not with Parker still hunting them. They had no family to turn to, no friends who wouldn't betray them for the reward Parker had surely offered. I don't know yet, she admitted. But we'll figure it out together. We always do, don't we? Hannah nodded solemnly. Together, she agreed a word that had become their private affirmation through months of uncertainty. They continued their chores, Maggie's mind working over possibilities. Perhaps they could make it to Helena, or even all the way to Oregon. Start fresh, where no one knew the name Sinclair, or the scandal attached to it. But such journeys required money resources they didn't have. By midday, as promised, Thad returned. He carried 2 rabbits and a grouse, but his expression was grim. Parker's men were in the North Woods, he reported, hanging his coat by the door. They've widened their search area. Maggie's heart sank. How close, too close, within a mile. Thad set his game on the table and began cleaning it with methodical precision. We need supplies from town and information. I can't risk another trip alone, it would raise suspicion, but we need to know what Parker is planning. I'll go with you, Maggie offered impulsively. Thad looked up sharply. That would be foolish. You're the one they're hunting. Not if they don't recognize me. Maggie touched her hair, which she'd kept braided and pinned close to her head during their stay. I can change my appearance, and no one would expect Conrad Sinclair's refined wife to be a simple mountain woman accompanying the reclusive Dr. Remington. Thad considered this, his knife pausing over the rabbit. It's risky. Everything is risky now, Maggie countered. And 4 eyes in town will see more than 2. Hannah is well enough to travel a short distance, and keeping her hidden in plain sight might be safer than leaving her here alone. Hannah, who had been quietly listening, spoke up. I can be very quiet in town, Mama. I promise. Thad's gaze moved from mother to daughter, weighing options and dangers. Finally, he nodded. Tomorrow, then. But we'll need to prepare carefully. And if there's any sign of trouble, we separate you, take Hannah to the church. Reverend Wallace and I have our differences, but he won't turn away a woman and child in need. The decision made, they spent the remainder of the day in preparation. Thad showed Maggie a route into town that avoided the main road. Maggie altered one of Thad's old shirts to fit her more slimly and fashioned a rough bonnet that would shadow her face. For Hannah, they created a story she was to be Thad's niece, visiting from Helena. That evening, as Hannah slept deeply for the first time since her illness, Thad and Maggie sat by the fire speaking in low voices. There's something you should know, Thad said, his hands busy whittling a small wooden horse. About Reverend Wallace and his wife. What about them? Maggie asked, mending a tear in Hannah's dress. They lost their son in the war. He was one of the patients who died under my care after the wilderness. Thad's knife continued its steady work, shaving thin curls of wood. That's why they, particularly Mrs. Wallace, bear me such ill will. Maggie's hands stilled. I'm sorry. That must make living near Clearwater difficult for you. It's why I keep to myself, Thad acknowledged, though some, like the person who threw that rock through my window, aren't content to simply avoid me. Who was it? The rock thrower, I mean. Joseph Thornton, most likely. He was a medical orderly during the war, worked under me for a time. Now he's Parker's deputy and general right hand. Thad's expression darkened. He testified against me at the court-martial, claimed he saw me negligently contaminate medical supplies. But the court cleared you, Maggie reminded him. Evidence cleared me. The river contamination was proven. But Thornton's testimony planted seeds of doubt that never fully died. Thad set aside his knife and the half-finished horse. He works for Parker now, and he's nearly as dangerous. If you see him in town, avoid him at all costs. Maggie nodded, committing the name to memory. How will I recognize him? Tall, thin, with a long scar down his left cheek. Always wears a black coat even in summer. Thad's description was precise, clinical. He has a way of watching people that makes your skin crawl. Noted, Maggie said with a slight shiver. Anyone else I should be wary of? Thad considered. The mercantile owner, Silas Jenkins. He's Parker's cousin by marriage and reports everything he sees. And Martha Jenkins, his wife, she runs the town's gossip mill with ruthless efficiency. Maggie tucked these names away as well, adding them to her mental map of Clearwater's hazards. It seems you know a great deal about the town for someone who keeps to himself. Knowing your adversaries is basic strategy, Thad replied. I may avoid people, but I pay attention. They fell silent, the fire crackling between them. Outside, an owl called its lonely sound, carrying through the night. Maggie finished her mending and set it aside, her gaze drawn to the flames. Tomorrow will be dangerous, she said quietly. If anything happens to me— It won't, Thad interrupted firmly. But if it does, Maggie persisted, promise me you'll keep Hannah safe. Get her away from here somewhere Parker can't reach her. Thad's eyes, reflecting the firelight, met hers steadily. I promise, he said, the words carrying the weight of both the present commitment and the past, one he had failed to keep. But nothing is going to happen to you, not while I'm there. The conviction in his voice warmed Maggie more than the fire. For so long she had carried her burdens alone, made decisions with no one to share the weight of consequence. To have someone, even this gruff, damaged man, stand beside her was a gift she had forgotten existed. Thank you, she said simply. Thad nodded once, then resumed his whittling. The small wooden horse took shape beneath his skilled hands, a silent testament to patience and care that spoke more eloquently than words. Dawn broke clear and cold, the sky a pale, perfect blue above the snow-covered landscape. They set out early, Thad leading the way along a narrow trail that wound through dense pine forest. Hannah, bundled warmly and still somewhat weak from her illness, rode on Thad's shoulders, her small hands gripping his hat for balance. Maggie followed, dressed in the altered shirt and her own skirt, the rough bonnet shadowing her features. With her hair tucked away and her face bare of the cosmetics she'd worn as Conrad's wife, she looked like a different woman, one who belonged to these mountains rather than Boston drawing rooms. Remember, Thad said as they approached the outskirts of Clearwater, you're Rose Miller, my housekeeper's cousin, helping out while Hannah recovers from her illness. If anyone asks too many questions, let me do the talking. Rose Miller, Maggie repeated, settling into the role. From Helena. And I'm Uncle Thad, Hannah piped up from her perch, clearly enjoying the pretense. That's right, Thad confirmed, his voice gentler than Maggie had ever heard it. But remember what we talked about in town. You need to be quiet and stay close to your mama and me. Hannah nodded solemnly. Because of the bad men who might take me away. Just as a precaution, Thad assured her, squeezing her small foot where it dangled near his chest. Nothing's going to happen to you. The first buildings of Clearwater came into view, a scattering of wooden structures clinging to the banks of the river that had given the town its name. Despite its small size, Clearwater bustled with activity. The railroad had brought prosperity, temporary as it might be, and the wide main street was crowded with wagons, horses, and pedestrians. Thad lowered Hannah to the ground as they reached the edge of town, taking her hand firmly in his. With his other hand, he gripped his walking stick, his gait becoming more pronounced on the uneven street. Maggie walked on Hannah's other side, keeping her head slightly lowered, observing the town through the shadowed edges of her bonnet. Clearwater was both familiar and strange to her now. She had lived here for 2 years as Conrad Sinclair's wife, moving through these same streets with the confidence of position and wealth. Now she was a fugitive, seeing the familiar storefronts and faces from a radically different perspective. They passed the sheriff's office, a solid building of squared logs with a small jail attached at the rear. Through the window, Maggie glimpsed a man she recognized as one of Parker's deputies. She kept her face averted, her heart rate accelerating despite her efforts at calm. "The mercantile first," Thad murmured. "We need supplies, then the apothecary for medicines. Keep your eyes and ears open, but don't draw attention." The mercantile was crowded, which provided both cover and risk. Thad moved through the store with purpose, selecting necessities with an economy of movement that suggested long practice. Flour, coffee, salt, ammunition. Maggie added items to their basket as well, choosing things a housekeeper's cousin might select, practical, inexpensive staples. Hannah stayed close, her eyes wide, as she took in the colorful displays of fabric and candy. Once she tugged at Maggie's skirt, pointing to a display of small toys. "Mama, look," she whispered. "Not today, sweetheart," Maggie replied softly, conscious of maintaining their cover. "Perhaps a small treat for being so brave during your illness," Thad suggested unexpectedly, reaching for a stick of striped candy. "Would you like that, Hannah?" The child's face lit up, her smile transforming her from solemn to radiant in an instant. "Yes, please, Uncle Thad." The endearment, practiced though it was, seemed to affect Thad deeply. His weathered face softened, and he ruffled Hannah's hair with awkward affection before turning to pay for their purchases. Silas Jenkins, the mercantile owner, tallied their items with sharp eyes that missed nothing. "Don't often see you in town, Dr. Remington," he observed, emphasizing the title with slight mockery. "And with company, no less." "Just supplies, Jenkins," Thad replied evenly. "Nothing worth gossiping about." Jenkins's gaze moved to Maggie, lingering with uncomfortable scrutiny. "Don't believe I've had the pleasure, ma'am." "Rose Miller," Maggie said, keeping her voice low and slightly accented, different from her natural speech. "Just helping the doctor while my young cousin recovers." "Miller, you say any relation to Joseph Miller over by Copper Creek?" "No relation I know of," Maggie replied, feigning disinterest in the conversation. "I'm from Helena myself." Jenkins seemed about to ask another question when the door opened, admitting a gust of cold air and a tall, thin man in a black coat. Immediately, Thad tensed his hand, moving to Hannah's shoulder in a protective gesture. "Joseph," Jenkins greeted the newcomer. "The doctor here was just introducing his housekeeper's cousin." Joseph Thornton's cold eyes swept over their small group, lingering on Maggie with unsettling intensity. The scar on his cheek pulled his mouth into a permanent half-sneer, giving even his smile a predatory quality. "Doctor," he acknowledged with exaggerated courtesy. "How domestic you've become. And who is this little one?" Before Thad could answer, Hannah spoke up. "I'm Hannah. Uncle Thad gave me candy because I was brave when I was sick." Thornton crouched to the child's level, his movement fluid and somehow threatening despite its gentleness. Did he now? And was Uncle Thad a good doctor? Did he make you all better? The best doctor, Hannah declared with childish loyalty. He listened to the ocean in my chest with his special stick. Thornton's eyes flickered up to Thad malice, evident in their depths. How fortunate for you. Not all of the doctor's patients have been so lucky. Thad's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice level. We should be on our way. The apothecary closes early on Tuesdays. Of course. Thornton straightened, stepping aside with exaggerated courtesy. Don't let me keep you from your errands. As they gathered their purchases and moved toward the door, Thornton's voice followed them. Strange times we live in, Jenkins. Women and children disappearing, reappearing. Hard to know who's who these days. Outside, Thad set a brisk pace toward the apothecary, his face grim. He suspects something, he muttered. Or at least he's curious. What do we do? Maggie asked, keeping her voice low. Complete our business and leave as quickly as possible. But we need to split up for a moment. Thad glanced around, then pointed to a small church at the end of the street. Take Hannah and wait for me there. I need to check something at the telegraph office. Is that wise? Maggie's concern was evident in her voice. Necessary, Thad replied grimly. Parker's been sending telegrams daily. I need to know why. Before Maggie could protest further, a woman's voice called out from across the street. Dr. Remington. A moment of your time. They turned to see a severe-looking older woman approaching, her gray hair pulled back in a tight bun, her black dress immaculate despite the muddy street. Mrs. Millicent Wallace, the Reverend's wife, moved toward them with purpose, her gaze fixed on Hannah. Mrs. Wallace, Thad acknowledged stiffly, I'm afraid we're in a hurry. I can see that, she replied, her tone frosty. But I couldn't help noticing the child. Is she ill? Recovering, Thad said shortly. If you'll excuse us. What's your name, dear? Mrs. Wallace asked Hannah directly, ignoring Thad's dismissal. Hannah looked up at Maggie, uncertain. Maggie nodded encouragingly, squeezing her daughter's hand. Hannah, the child answered politely. Hannah, Mrs. Wallace repeated, studying the girl's face with unexpected intensity. Such a pretty name, and such lovely eyes, so blue like cornflowers. Thank you, ma'am, Hannah replied, the formal address sounding strange from her young lips. Mrs. Wallace's gaze shifted to Maggie, sharp and assessing. You must be very proud of your daughter, Mrs. Miller, Maggie supplied, forcing herself to meet the older woman's eyes, despite the discomfort it caused. Rose Miller, and yes, I am. Miller, Mrs. Wallace echoed clearly, not believing it. Her gaze returned to Thad, hardening. I'm surprised at you, Doctor, involving innocent parties in your situation. Thad straightened his hand, tightening on his walking stick. As I said, Mrs. Wallace, we're in a hurry. Your concerns are noted as always. Are they? The older woman's voice lowered. Then note this as well. Sheriff Parker was asking after you just this morning. Something about unusual purchases at the apothecary. I would tread carefully if I were you. Her eyes flicked to Hannah again, softening almost imperceptibly. For everyone's sake. With that cryptic warning, she nodded stiffly and continued on her way, her back ramrod straight, her steps measured and precise. The church, Thad said as soon as she was out of earshot. Now, I'll meet you there in 15 minutes. Thad, Maggie began, alarmed by the exchange. 15 minutes, he repeated firmly. Trust me. With that, he strode away, his uneven gait carrying him swiftly toward the telegraph office at the far end of the street. Maggie watched him go, anxiety building in her chest. Then, taking Hannah's hand firmly in hers, she turned toward the small white church that stood apart from the other buildings, its simple spire reaching toward the clear blue sky. "Why was that lady looking at me funny, Mama?" Hannah asked as they walked. Maggie searched for a simple answer that wouldn't frighten her daughter. "Sometimes people are curious about newcomers," she said finally, "especially children as special as you." She had sad eyes, Hannah observed with a child's perception. "Like the angel in my dream." Maggie squeezed Hannah's hand, unsettled by the comparison. "Let's see if the church is open, shall we? It will be warm inside." The church door yielded to her touch, swinging open on well-oiled hinges. Inside the space was simple but beautiful plain wooden pews, tall windows that filled the sanctuary with light, a modest altar adorned with a single wooden cross. It was empty, save for a middle-aged man arranging hymnals in the front pew. He looked up at their entrance, his face weathered but kind, his clerical collar marking him as Reverend Wallace. "Good day," he greeted them. "The church is always open to those seeking sanctuary." The choice of words seemed deliberate, causing Maggie to wonder how much the Reverend knew or suspected about their situation. "Thank you," she replied cautiously. "We're just waiting for Dr. Remington. He suggested we meet him here." Reverend Wallace's eyebrows rose slightly. "Did he now? That's unexpected." He set down the hymnal he was holding and approached them, his manner gentle. "Remington doesn't usually seek the comfort of the church." "It was a practical suggestion, I believe," Maggie said carefully, "for shelter while we wait." "Of course." The Reverend nodded, his gaze like his wife's drawn to Hannah. "Hello there, young lady. Are you enjoying your visit to Clearwater?" Hannah nodded shyly. "Yes, sir. Uncle Thad bought me candy." "Uncle Thad!" The Reverend's surprise was evident. "Well, that's interesting. I didn't realize Remington had family visiting." "He's not really my uncle," Hannah confided with a child's honesty. "But he's nice. He makes the bad coughs go away and tells good stories." Reverend Wallace's expression softened. "I'm sure he does," he said, glancing at Maggie with newfound speculation in his eyes. "You're welcome to wait as long as needed. The church is a place of peace for all." "Thank you, Reverend," Maggie said sincerely. "That's most kind." He nodded and returned to his task with the hymnals. Though Maggie noticed he kept glancing their way, his expression thoughtful. She led Hannah to a pew near the back of the church, where they could see the door while remaining somewhat hidden from casual observation through the windows. The minutes stretched, each one increasing Maggie's anxiety. Hannah, sensing her mother's tension, remained unusually quiet, her small legs swinging beneath the pew as she studied the colorful stained glass window above the altar. Finally, just as Maggie was beginning to fear the worst, the church door opened and Thad entered. His face was grim, his movements more hurried than usual. He nodded briefly to Reverend Wallace, then joined Maggie and Hannah in the back pew. "We need to leave," he said in a low voice. "Now, Parker's received word from Chicago about the adoption agency you mentioned." Maggie's heart sank. "What does that mean?" "It means they're connecting dots we don't want connected," Thad replied. "And Thornton was heading toward the sheriff's office when I left the telegraph. We need to go before they start actively looking for a woman and child matching your descriptions." Reverend Wallace approached, having evidently overheard parts of their conversation. "Is there trouble, Dr. Remington?" he asked quietly. Thad hesitated, clearly weighing how much to reveal. "Nothing that need concern you, Reverend." "If you're in danger, any of you, perhaps I can help," the older man offered. "Despite our past differences." "The less you know, the better," Thad said firmly. For your sake, as much as ours. Wallace studied them for a moment, his gaze lingering on Hannah. She reminds me of someone, he said suddenly. Something about the eyes. Thad tensed visibly. We really must be going. Of course. The Reverend stepped aside, but not before adding, the church's cellar can be accessed through the side door if ever you find yourselves in need of deeper sanctuary, day or night. The offer hung in the air, unexpected and profound. Thad nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement and perhaps gratitude. Then, taking Hannah's hand, he led them toward the door, Maggie following close behind. They left through a side exit, avoiding the main street. Thad set a quick pace despite his limp, guiding them through back alleys and between buildings until they reached the edge of town. Only when they were among the trees of the forest path did he slow, allowing Hannah to catch her breath. What did you find out? Maggie asked, her voice tight with anxiety. Thad glanced down at Hannah, then at Maggie, his expression grave. The adoption agency in Chicago, it was raided 3 months ago. Illegal operations trafficking in orphans. He lowered his voice. And Parker knows. He's been investigating Conrad's connection to it since before his death. Maggie's face paled. Conrad was involved in that too. It appears so, Thad confirmed grimly. And now Parker is trying to find records, witnesses, anything that would implicate others or lead to whatever money was involved. And Hannah, Maggie's voice trembled slightly. What does this mean for her? Thad's gaze softened as it fell on the child who was examining a pine cone she had found, blissfully unaware of the adult conversation. It means her adoption may not have been legal. It means we need to know more about how Conrad acquired her. He hesitated, and it means the connection to Emma Hayes is stronger than I initially thought. Maggie absorbed this, her mind racing with implications. We can't go back to the cabin, can we? Not yet, Thad agreed. Parker's men will be checking it soon if they haven't already. We need to find another shelter at least for tonight. But where? Maggie looked around at the vast wilderness surrounding them, beautiful but unforgiving. Thad adjusted his course slightly, leading them deeper into the forest, away from the path back to his cabin. I know a place, he said, an old trapper's hut about 3 miles from here. It's not much, but it will keep us out of the cold while we decide our next move. As they walked, Hannah grew tired, her recent illness having sapped her strength. Without comment, Thad lifted her onto his shoulders again, continuing forward with determined steps, despite the added burden. Maggie watched them, struck by the tableau they presented, the gruff, damaged doctor and the small, trusting child bound together by circumstances neither could have imagined. The forest grew denser, the trees closing around them like protective sentinels. Above, the sky was still clear, but Thad's frequent glances upward suggested he was watching for weather changes. Montana winters were notoriously fickle sunshine, giving way to blizzards with little warning. Almost there, Thad announced, after nearly an hour of steady travel. Just over this ridge. The trapper's hut was little more than a crude shelter, a single room with walls of stacked logs, a dirt floor, and a stone fireplace. But it was solid, hidden among thick pines, and clearly had not been used for some time. Thad set Hannah down gently and went to work immediately, clearing old debris from the fireplace, checking for animal nests, and preparing to make the space habitable. Maggie joined him, organizing their supplies and setting out the few comforts they had brought from town. Hannah, recovering her energy after the rest on Thad's shoulders, explored the small space with interest, asking questions about the animal pelts still hanging on one wall and the rusty traps stacked in a corner. By the time darkness fell, they had a fire going, blankets spread near the hearth, and a simple meal prepared from their supplies. The hut was far from comfortable, but it offered shelter, and most importantly, secrecy. As Hannah drifted to sleep beside the fire wrapped in a blanket, with her head pillowed on Maggie's lap, Thad and Maggie spoke in low voices, planning their next steps. "We can't stay here long," Thad observed. "There's no water source nearby, and the supplies we have won't last more than a few days." "Could we make it to the next town?" Maggie suggested. "Helena, perhaps." Thad shook his head. "Parker will have telegraphed descriptions to every settlement within 100 miles. And winter travel with a child—" He left the sentence unfinished, but the risks were clear to both of them. "Then what?" Maggie asked, her fingers absently stroking Hannah's hair. "We can't keep running forever. She deserves a stable life, a home." Thad stared into the fire, his face shadowed with thought. "There's one option we haven't considered," he said finally. "Confronting the truth, all of it." "What do you mean?" "I mean finding out exactly what Conrad was involved in. Finding proof of Parker's corruption, and clearing your name." Thad's eyes, reflecting the flames, met hers across the small space. "It won't be easy, and it will be dangerous. But it might be the only way to truly keep Hannah safe in the long run." Maggie considered this, fear and hope warring within her. "How would we even begin?" "By finding Conrad's missing ledger," Thad said simply. "The one Parker is so desperate to locate. It must contain names, details, evidence that could expose everything." "But I don't know where it is," Maggie protested. "I've told you that." "I believe you," Thad assured her. "But Conrad must have hidden it somewhere he considered safe, somewhere he could access it without arousing suspicion." Maggie's brow furrowed in thought. "He did have a safe in his study, but Parker would have searched that immediately after his death." "What about other properties? Did Conrad own land buildings in town?" "The house in Clearwater, of course, a warehouse by the railroad, and—" Maggie paused, a memory surfacing. "A hunting cabin, up near Elk Ridge. He went there occasionally, claimed it was for hunting trips, but he never brought back game." Thad leaned forward, interest sharpening his features. "Did Parker know about it?" "I don't think so," Maggie said slowly. "Conrad was secretive about it, said it was his private retreat from business pressures. I was never invited there." "That could be it," Thad said, excitement entering his voice for the first time since she'd known him. "A perfect hiding place for sensitive documents, away from prying eyes, yet accessible when needed." "But I don't know exactly where it is," Maggie admitted. "Only that it's somewhere on Elk Ridge." "That's a start," Thad said. "We can narrow it down. Elk Ridge isn't that large, and a cabin would leave signs, smoke-cleared paths." Maggie nodded slowly, hope beginning to bloom despite her caution. "And if we find the ledger—" "Then we have leverage," Thad said grimly. "Enough, perhaps, to force Parker to back down, or failing that, to take to federal authorities." They fell silent, each contemplating the risks and possibilities of this new plan. Hannah stirred in her sleep, murmuring something about stars before settling again. Maggie gazed down at her daughter's peaceful face, strengthening her resolve. For Hannah's sake, she would face whatever dangers lay ahead. "There's something else we should discuss," Thad said after a moment, his voice hesitant now. "About Hannah. About who she might really be." Maggie tensed her arms, tightening protectively around her sleeping child. "You still believe she's Emma Hayes?" "The evidence points that way," Thad said gently. "The scar, the timing, the connection to the illegal adoption agency. And now there's Mrs. Wallace's reaction to her." "What about it?" "Daniel Hayes served under Wallace's command early in the war. They were close. Wallace was transferred before the wilderness, but he knew Daniel's family. Thad's voice softened. Mrs. Wallace would have known Emma as an infant, and she recognized something in Hannah today. I saw it in her face. Maggie absorbed this, her throat tight with emotion. What does it mean? For Hannah, for us, it means she has a history, a connection to people who might have cared for her, Thad said carefully. It doesn't change that you're her mother now, in all the ways that truly matter. But it's part of who she is, a part she might want to know someday. Tears welled in Maggie's eyes, and she brushed them away with her free hand. I'm afraid, she admitted in a whisper. Afraid that if she knows, if others know, they might try to take her from me. I couldn't bear that, Thad. She's everything to me. Thad moved closer, settling beside her near the fire. After a moment's hesitation, he placed his hand over hers where it rested on Hannah's shoulder, a gesture so unexpected and gentle that it nearly undid her composure completely. No one will take her from you, he promised, his voice rough with emotion. Not while I'm alive to prevent it. Whatever we discover, whatever truths come to light, that much, I can swear to you. The firelight played across his weathered features, illuminating sincerity and determination in equal measure. Maggie found herself believing him, this broken, honorable man, who had opened his door to them on a snowy night, and in doing so had perhaps set all their lives on a new course. Thank you, she whispered, turning her hand beneath his to clasp it briefly. For everything. Thad nodded, seemingly unable to speak for a moment. Then he withdrew his hand and rose, moving to add another log to the fire. We should both rest, he said practically. Tomorrow will be challenging enough. As Maggie settled beside Hannah for the night, she watched Thad take up his customary position of sentinel back against the wall rifle across his knees. Despite the uncertainties that lay ahead, despite the dangers that surrounded them, she felt an unfamiliar sensation stealing through her weary body. Hope, fragile but persistent, like the first green shoot pushing through winter snow. Whatever came next, they would face it together. She, Thad, and Hannah, bound by circumstance choice, and perhaps something more profound than either. Outside, the wind rose, whispering through pine branches. Inside the crude shelter, the fire burned steadily, casting its warm glow over three people who had each in their own way been lost before finding one another. In that moment of quiet, as sleep finally claimed her, Maggie understood what Hannah had meant about the angel's sad eyes. Some sorrows ran too deep for tears, leaving only a quiet resignation behind. But perhaps, just perhaps, such sorrows could be healed, not by forgetting the past, but by building something new from its broken pieces. Dawn brought the smell of snow on the air, that distinctive crispness that heralded changing weather. Thad, who had dozed only fitfully through the night, stepped outside the trapper's hut to assess their situation. The sky above was gray and heavy with clouds, the wind shifting to the north. A storm was coming, perhaps by nightfall. Their plan to search Elk Ridge for Conrad's hunting cabin would need to be accelerated. They couldn't risk being caught in the open when the snow began falling in earnest. Returning inside, he found Maggie already awake, heating water for coffee over the small fire. Hannah still slept curled in her blanket, like a hibernating animal. Storm coming, Thad reported quietly, setting his rifle aside. We should move soon. Maggie nodded, her expression resolute, despite the shadows of exhaustion beneath her eyes. How far to Elk Ridge? About 5 miles northwest, Thad replied, accepting the cup of coffee she offered. Rough country, but not impossible. The challenge will be finding the cabin before the weather turns. They breakfasted simply on bread and dried meat from their supplies, then gently woke Hannah. The child was still tired from the previous day's exertions, but her eyes brightened at the prospect of an adventure to find a secret cabin. "Will there be treasure?" she asked excitedly, as Maggie helped her dress warmly for the journey. "Perhaps, of a sort," Thad answered, his mouth quirking in a rare smile. "Knowledge can be the most valuable treasure of all." Hannah considered this with solemn attention. "Like in your books, the ones with the pictures of inside people?" "Anatomy books," Thad corrected, impressed by her observation. "And yes, like those. They contain knowledge that helps doctors heal people." "And we're looking for knowledge that will help Mama," Hannah concluded with surprising insight. "So the bad men will stop chasing us." Thad and Maggie exchanged glances over the child's head, both struck by her perceptiveness. "That's right," Maggie confirmed, tying Hannah's bonnet securely. "Very clever of you to understand that." "I'm smart," Hannah agreed, without boasting, simply stating a fact. "Uncle Thad said so when he listened to my chest. He said I ask good questions." The casual repetition of Uncle Thad sent an unexpected warmth through Thad's chest. It had been so long since anyone had claimed connection to him, even in pretense. The fact that Hannah did so with such natural ease was both painful and precious. They left the trapper's hut shortly after, carefully concealing signs of their presence. Thad led the way, setting a pace that Hannah could manage with occasional breaks. The terrain grew steadily more challenging as they moved northwest, the gentle forest giving way to rockier slopes and denser underbrush. By midday, they had reached the base of Elk Ridge, a modest elevation that nonetheless offered a commanding view of the surrounding valley. Thad called a halt, providing a chance for Hannah to rest and for all of them to eat a small meal of jerky and hard biscuits. "How do we find one cabin in all this wilderness?" Maggie asked, gazing up at the wooded slopes. "We look for signs," Thad explained. "A trail smoke cleared areas, and we think, like Conrad, where would a man want his secret retreat? Not too exposed, but with a view. Near water, probably." "There's a stream on the eastern slope," Maggie recalled. "Conrad mentioned fishing there once. That narrows it down." Thad nodded approvingly. "We'll start there and work our way up." They continued their ascent, the going slower now as the ground grew steeper. Hannah tired quickly, and Thad found himself carrying her for increasingly long stretches despite the strain on his leg. The prosthetic, serviceable enough on level ground, became a liability on the uneven terrain, forcing him to rely heavily on his walking stick. Maggie noticed his struggle but said nothing, merely offering her arm on particularly difficult sections, a silent partnership that required no acknowledgement. Thad accepted the help without comment, recognizing it as the practical necessity it was, rather than an insult to his pride. They found the stream Maggie had mentioned, its waters running swift and clear between ice-rimmed banks. Following it upward, they began to scan the surrounding forest for any sign of human habitation. "There," Maggie said suddenly, pointing to a barely discernible path diverging from the stream bed. "That looks deliberate, not like an animal trail." Thad studied it, noting the subtle signs of maintenance branches trimmed back rather than broken stones arranged to provide stable footing on a steep section. "Good eye," he approved. "That's human work, all right." The path led them away from the stream and into a stand of mature pines. After a quarter-mile of steady climbing, it opened suddenly into a small clearing where a cabin stood, larger and more substantial than the trapper's hut, but still modest and clearly designed to blend with its surroundings. "This must be it," Maggie breathed recognition in her voice. Conrad described the clearing, the view. The cabin was well built of squared logs, with a stone chimney, its windows shuttered against the elements. A small covered porch protected the front door, and a woodpile stood neatly stacked along one wall. Everything spoke of periodic but consistent maintenance. This was no abandoned retreat, but a place regularly visited and cared for. Thad set Hannah down his hand, moving to his rifle. "Stay close," he warned. "We don't know if anyone else knows about this place." They approached cautiously, Thad in the lead, Maggie holding Hannah's hand tightly. The cabin appeared deserted. No smoke from the chimney, no tracks in the thin dusting of snow around it. Still, Thad circled it completely before approaching the door, checking for any signs of recent visitors. "Looks clear," he concluded finally, "but stay alert." The door was secured with a heavy iron padlock. Thad examined it, then looked to Maggie. "Any idea where Conrad would have kept the key?" Maggie shook her head. "He wore a key on his watch chain, but I never knew what it was for. It might have been this." Thad considered the lock, then handed his rifle to Maggie. "Stand back," he instructed, drawing a small leather pouch from his coat pocket. From it, he extracted slender metal tools, a legacy of battlefield improvisation when accessing medical supplies often required bypass in locking systems. With surprising dexterity for hands so large, Thad manipulated the tools in the lock, his expression one of intense concentration. After several minutes of careful work, there was a satisfying click, and the padlock sprang open. "Impressive," Maggie remarked. Thad returned the tools to his pocket with a slight shrug. "War teaches many skills, not all of them mentioned in polite company." He retrieved his rifle and eased the door open, gesturing for Maggie and Hannah to wait while he checked inside. The cabin's interior was shadowy, but revealed itself to be comfortably appointed, far more so than would be expected for a simple hunting retreat. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, flanked by built-in bookshelves. A large desk stood before the main window, positioned to take advantage of the view across the valley. A curtained alcove presumably contained sleeping quarters, while a small kitchen area occupied the far corner. "It's safe," Thad called back, allowing Maggie and Hannah to enter. Maggie looked around with evident surprise. "This is not what I expected," she admitted. "It's almost luxurious." "More like a private office than a hunting cabin," Thad agreed, noting the quality of the furnishings and the extensive library. "Your husband clearly used this place for more than escaping business pressures." Hannah had already gravitated to the bookshelves, examining the leather-bound volumes with careful fingers. "These have numbers in them," she announced, having opened one. "Lots and lots of numbers." Thad joined her, taking the book gently from her hands. It was indeed filled with columns of figures, dates and cryptic notations, financial records of some kind, but without clear identification of sources or purposes. "Conrad's private accounts, perhaps," Maggie suggested, looking over Thad's shoulder. "He always kept separate books from the official business ledgers." "Let's search systematically," Thad proposed, setting the book aside. "The ledger Parker's looking for would likely be more than just figures, names, details, perhaps maps or routes." They divided the cabin between them, Maggie taking the desk and its contents, Thad examining the bookshelves and storage chests, while Hannah was given the simple task of looking under furniture for anything that might have fallen or been hidden. The search proceeded methodically for nearly an hour, yielding various documents, land deeds, correspondence, more financial records, but nothing that matched their expectations for the crucial ledger. Frustration began to mount as the light outside dimmed the approaching storm, gradually obscuring the sun. "It has to be here somewhere," Maggie said, closing the last desk drawer with a sigh of disappointment. This was Conrad's private sanctuary, his secret place. Thad stood in the center of the room, turning slowly as he surveyed the space with a critical eye. "If you had something truly valuable, truly incriminating," he mused aloud, "where would you hide it? Not in an obvious place like a desk or bookshelf." His gaze traveled upward, noting the exposed beams of the ceiling, then down to the plank flooring. "Hannah," he said suddenly, "you mentioned finding treasure earlier. If you were hiding treasure in this cabin, where would you put it? Hannah considered the question with serious attention, her small face scrunched in thought. Under the floor, she decided finally. That's where pirates hide gold in stories. Thad smiled approvingly. Exactly what I was thinking. He began to examine the floorboards more carefully, tapping occasionally with his walking stick, listening for hollow sounds or signs of disturbance in the planking. Near the fireplace, a bearskin rug covered a portion of the floor. Thad moved it aside, revealing planks that appeared identical to the others. But as he knelt to examine them more closely, he noticed subtle differences. The spacing was slightly off, and the nails securing them were newer than those elsewhere. "Here," he announced, probing the edge of one plank with his knife. "These have been removed and replaced." With careful leverage, he pried up the loosest board, revealing a space beneath. And there, wrapped in oilcloth and tucked into a small metal box, was a leather-bound book, thicker and more substantial than the accounting journals on the shelves. "The ledger," Maggie breathed as Thad extracted it from its hiding place. Before he could open it, however, a sound from outside froze them all in place, the unmistakable crunch of footsteps approaching the cabin. Thad moved swiftly, placing the ledger inside his coat and retrieving his rifle. "Back door," he whispered to Maggie. She shook her head. "Only the front," she mouthed back, gathering Hannah close. Thad's mind raced through options. The approaching visitor, presumably one person from the sound of the footsteps, would have seen signs of their entry. The open padlock on the door would make hiding futile. Flight was possible, but risky with the storm approaching and Hannah's limited stamina. "Behind me," he instructed quietly, positioning himself facing the door, rifle ready, but not raised. "Let me handle this." The footsteps reached the porch, followed by a pause. Then a tentative knock sounded on the door frame, not the behavior of someone expecting to find the cabin empty. "Hello?" called a female voice, young and frightened. "Is someone there? I need help." Thad and Maggie exchanged surprised glances. This was not Parker or one of his deputies. "Who's there?" Thad called back, keeping his rifle ready. "My name is Abigail Thornton," the voice replied, a tremor evident in it. "I'm hurt and I think someone's following me. Please, I saw the footprints in the snow. I know someone's inside." Thornton. The name hit Thad like a physical blow. Joseph Thornton's relative. A trap, perhaps. "How did you find this place?" he demanded through the closed door. "My Uncle Joseph brought me here once," the girl answered, her voice breaking slightly. "He works with Sheriff Parker. Please, I'm bleeding, and it's starting to snow again." Thad hesitated, torn between caution and his ingrained instinct to provide medical aid. Maggie touched his arm lightly. "We can't leave her out there if she's truly hurt," she whispered. "Storm coming, remember." After another moment's consideration, Thad nodded grimly. "Stand back from the door," he called. "Keep your hands where I can see them." Slowly he opened the door, rifle at the ready. On the porch stood a young woman, no more than 16 or 17, her face pale with cold and pain, one arm clutched protectively against her side. Blood had seeped through her fingers, staining her worn coat. Her hair had been cut short almost boyishly, and her clothes were those of a young man, a disguise perhaps for traveling alone. Despite her obvious distress, she kept her free hand raised as instructed, her dark eyes moving from Thad's rifle to his face with wary assessment. "You're not my uncle," she stated, relief evident in her voice. "No," Thad confirmed, lowering his rifle slightly, but not completely. "I'm Dr. Thaddeus Remington. This is Mrs. Sinclair and her daughter." The girl's eyes widened at Maggie's name. "Sinclair Conrad, Sinclair's wife, the one they're hunting. Thad tensed, ready to raise his rifle again, but the girl shook her head quickly. No, I'm not with them. I'm running from them, too. My uncle? She swayed slightly, her face going even paler. I think I'm going to... Thad moved swiftly, catching her as she began to collapse. The rifle clattered to the porch as he supported her weight, feeling warm blood seep onto his coat from her wounded side. Maggie helped me get her inside. He ordered medical training overriding caution. Clear the table. And together they brought the semi-conscious girl into the cabin, laying her on the cleared desk. Hannah watched wide-eyed from the corner as Thad quickly assessed the injury, cutting away the blood-soaked shirt with his pocket knife. Knife wound, he diagnosed grimly. Not immediately life-threatening, but she's lost blood and it needs cleaning and stitching. He glanced at Maggie. I need hot water, clean cloth if you can find any, and my medical kit from my pack. Maggie moved quickly to comply, lighting a fire in the hearth and setting water to boil. Hannah, sensing the urgency, stayed quietly out of the way, though her eyes remained fixed on the injured girl with solemn concern. As Thad prepared to treat the wound, Abigail regained full consciousness, her eyes focusing on him with recognition. You really are Remington, she murmured. Uncle Joseph talks about you. Not kindly. I'm sure he doesn't, Thad replied dryly, cleaning the area around the wound with careful movements. This is going to hurt. Try to stay still. Abigail nodded, then bit her lip hard as Thad began the painful process of cleaning the wound. To her credit, she made no sound beyond a sharp intake of breath, her hands gripping the edge of the table until her knuckles whitened. Who did this to you? Maggie asked, gently, holding the girl's shoulders steady. My uncle, Abigail replied through gritted teeth. He found out I'd been looking through his papers, about the women, the ones they move north. Thad's hands stilled momentarily, then resumed their work with renewed focus. The trafficking operation, he said. Conrad Sinclair's business. Abigail nodded, wincing as Thad began to stitch the wound. Uncle Joseph worked for Mr. Sinclair, and now for Sheriff Parker. They bring women in on the railroad, promise them jobs, then send them to mining camps and worse places up north. Her voice faltered. My mother was one of them years ago. She died when I was born. Uncle Joseph took me in, but he's not kind. How did you end up here wounded? Thad asked, keeping her talking, both to distract her from the pain and to assess the credibility of her story. I found documents. Abigail explained, her breathing shallow but controlled. Lists of names, payments. My mother's name was on an old list. I confronted Uncle Joseph and he... She glanced at Hannah, moderating her words. He was angry. I managed to get away, but not before this happened. And you came here because you knew about the cabin, Maggie prompted. Uncle Joseph brought me once last summer. He and Sheriff Parker used it for meetings sometimes. I don't think Mr. Sinclair knew they had access. Abigail's eyes drifted to Maggie. They're looking for you, Mrs. Sinclair, and for something your husband hid. A book, they said. We found it, Hannah piped up from her corner before Maggie could shush her. Under the floor, like pirate treasure. Despite her pain, Abigail managed a small smile at the child. Smart girl, she approved. That's exactly where Uncle Joseph and Sheriff Parker have been searching. They tore up floorboards all over town, trying to find it. Thad finished the last stitch and began bandaging the wound. You've been lucky, he told Abigail professionally. The knife missed anything vital. With proper care and rest, you should heal well. Thank you, Doctor, Abigail said sincerely. I know your reputation from the war. Uncle Joseph said terrible things, but my friend's father was one of your patients in a field hospital. He said you were the best surgeon he'd ever seen. The simple acknowledgement coming so unexpectedly caught Thad off guard. He had grown accustomed to suspicion and accusation, to being the murderer doctor of Clearwater's whispers. To hear a positive account of his service, even second-hand, was startling. "Your uncle was mistaken about many things, it seems," he said gruffly, securing the bandage. "Rest now. We need to decide our next steps before the storm worsens." Indeed, outside the cabin windows, snow had begun to fall in earnest, large flakes, swirling on the strengthening wind. The light was fading rapidly, the storm and approaching evening combining to create a premature twilight. Maggie helped Abigail into a more comfortable position on a pallet made from blankets found in the sleeping alcove, then joined Thad by the fire where he was washing blood from his hands. "Do you believe her?" she asked quietly, glancing back at the injured girl who was now talking softly with a curious Hannah. "The wound is real enough," Thad replied, "and her story aligns with what we already suspected about Conrad's operations." He dried his hands on a cloth, his expression thoughtful. "But her connection to Joseph Thornton concerns me. It could still be a trap of some kind, though an elaborate one." "She's just a girl," Maggie protested. "A girl who found her way to this remote cabin in a snowstorm with a convenient injury and knowledge of the very ledger we came seeking," Thad pointed out. "Caution is warranted at the very least." They were interrupted by Hannah, who had left Abigail's side to join them. "Abby says her uncle is a bad man who hurts people," she reported solemnly, "like father used to hurt Mama." Maggie knelt quickly, taking Hannah's hands in hers. "What did you tell her, Hannah?" "Nothing," Hannah assured her. But she guessed. She said she could tell, because she knows what it looks like when someone's been afraid for a long time. Thad and Maggie exchanged glances over Hannah's head, both struck by the insight. It was the kind of perception that came only from personal experience, a shared recognition of trauma that couldn't be easily fabricated. "I think we should trust her, Mama," Hannah continued earnestly. "She has sad eyes, but they're true eyes." "Out of the mouths of babes," Thad murmured, his skepticism softening. He had long ago learned to respect children's intuitive judgments of character, uncolored as they were by adult prejudices and expectations. Maggie nodded slowly. "We'll trust but verify," she decided. "And in any case, we can't send her back out into the storm." The decision made, they set about preparing for an unexpected night in the cabin. The approaching storm had forced their hand. Traveling back down the ridge in such weather would be dangerous, especially with an injured girl and a young child. They would have to wait it out. Thad secured the cabin as best he could, bringing in extra firewood from the pile outside, checking shutters, and setting their few weapons within easy reach. Maggie inventoried the cabin's supplies, finding enough preserved food to supplement their own provisions for at least a day or two. As full darkness descended and the storm howled around the cabin's sturdy walls, they gathered near the fire for a simple meal. Abigail, pale but alert, joined them at Thad's insistence that she needed nourishment to replace lost blood. "The ledger," she said as they ate, nodding toward the bulge in Thad's coat where he had stored it. "Have you looked at it yet?" "Not thoroughly," Thad admitted. "There hasn't been time." "May I see it?" she requested. "I might recognize names connections that would mean nothing to you." Thad hesitated, then removed the ledger from his coat. "You said your mother's name was on a list your uncle had. What was it?" "Sarah," Abigail replied. "Sarah Thornton, though that wasn't her real name. She was Sarah Miller before Joseph took her in. Before that, I don't know." Thad opened the ledger, its pages dense with handwritten entries, names, dates, amounts, destinations. He turned to the earliest entries, scanning for the name. "Here," he said, finally pointing to an entry dated 8 years earlier. "Sarah Miller arrived Chicago, May 1863. designated for special placement. He looked up at Abigail. Does that match what you know? The girl nodded, her eyes fixed on the page. That's when she came west, according to the documents I found. She died in November that same year, when I was born. Maggie had moved to look over Thad's shoulder, her expression growing increasingly troubled as she scanned the entries. There are dozens of names here, she whispered. All women, all with these cryptic designations: placement, northern route, special client. And accompanying payments, Thad noted grimly, substantial ones. Oh, Conrad was selling these women, Maggie said, the horror of realization evident in her voice. All this time, the business trips, the meetings, he was trafficking human beings. Thad turned more pages, moving forward in time. Parker's name appears regularly from 1865 onward, he observed, first as a recipient of payments, later as a full partner. And my uncle? Abigail asked, her voice tight. Thad continued scanning. Thornton J. begins appearing in 1867, initially as a courier, later with more substantial roles. Hannah, who had been listening with the focused attention children sometimes give to adult conversations beyond their full understanding, spoke up unexpectedly. Is my name in there? The innocent question struck them all to silence. Thad and Maggie exchanged a look of shared concern, while Abigail's expression softened with compassion. Why would you think that, sweetheart? Maggie asked gently. Hannah shrugged the gesture, disarmingly adult. Father said once that I was expensive, that he paid good money for me. I thought maybe he meant in the book. The simple statement hung in the air, devastating in its implications. Thad, his jaw tight with controlled anger, turned to the later pages of the ledger, searching with renewed purpose. Here, he said finally, his voice flat. October 1869. Special acquisition female child, approximately age 2, designated for C. Sinclair personal use. A payment of $500 is recorded. Maggie's face had gone pale. That's when we adopted Hannah, she whispered. Conrad said it was through a legitimate agency in Chicago, that her parents had died in the war. They may well have. Thad said, his voice gentler now. But the means by which she came to you were clearly not as represented. He turned another page, and his breath caught. There, in Conrad's precise handwriting, was a notation that seemed to confirm his suspicions. Child previously designated Emma H. Origins Wilderness Campaign, 1864. Medical attention required for head injury subsequently resolved. Emma H. Thad repeated softly, looking up at Hannah with new certainty. Emma Hayes. The storm outside seemed to intensify in that moment, wind shrieking around the cabin's eaves like a living thing. Within, the fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across faces now transformed by revelations too profound for immediate comprehension. Hannah, sensing the weight of the moment, without understanding its full significance, moved to Maggie's side, leaning against her mother with complete trust. Am I still your Hannah? She asked in a small voice. Maggie gathered her daughter close, fierce protection evident in every line of her body. Always, she promised, her voice breaking slightly. No matter what name you had before, you are my Hannah, now and forever. Thad closed the ledger, his expression grave but resolute. This changes things, he said quietly. This ledger is more than evidence of Conrad and Parker's crimes. It's proof of Hannah's true identity, her connection to Daniel Hayes. He looked directly at Maggie. And it gives us leverage not just against Parker, but for securing Hannah's future legally. What do you mean? Maggie asked, arms still tight around her daughter. I mean that with this evidence, we can prove that Conrad acquired Hannah illegally, that her adoption was fraudulent, and that opens the possibility of having you recognized as her legal guardian through proper channels. Thad's voice grew stronger, more certain. It won't be easy, but with this ledger and my testimony about Daniel Hayes's last wishes, I believe it can be done. Hope flickered in Maggie's eyes, but caution tempered it. Parker will never allow this to come to light. He'd kill us all first. Not if we get the ledger to federal authorities, Abigail interjected, sitting straighter despite her injury. The U.S. Marshal in Helena has been investigating disappearances along the railroad for months. Uncle Joseph was worried about it. I heard him talking to Sheriff Parker. Helena is at least 3 days' journey in good weather, Thad pointed out. Longer in winter with a child and now an injured girl. There's another option, Abigail said hesitantly. There's a telegraph office in Silver Creek, just over the ridge to the north, not as far as Clearwater. If we could get word to the marshal from there, Parker likely has that office watched as well, Thad countered. Not as closely, Abigail insisted. It's smaller, less frequently used, and the operator, Mr. Jenkins, isn't friendly with my uncle or the sheriff. He might help. Thad considered this, weighing risks and possibilities. Outside, the storm continued to rage, limiting their immediate options, regardless of decision. We'll discuss it further in the morning, he said finally. For now, we all need rest. It's been a long day of revelations. They arranged sleeping areas near the fire, Abigail on her pallet. Maggie and Hannah sharing blankets nearby Thad, taking his customary position of sentinel, though he agreed to alternate watches with Maggie through the night. As the others settled, Thad remained awake, the ledger secure beside him, his mind working through implications and plans. The document in his possession was dynamite evidence of crimes that stretched across state lines, implicated officials, and revealed a trafficking network of considerable scope. It was also, perhaps, the key to fulfilling his promise to Daniel Hayes at last. He glanced at Hannah, sleeping peacefully in Maggie's protective embrace. Emma Hayes, the child he had failed to protect years ago, had somehow found her way back into his life. And Maggie Sinclair, a woman who had endured more than her share of hardship, had loved and protected that child as her own, through circumstances she could never have imagined. Fate, it seemed, had a strange sense of irony. And perhaps, Thad reflected, as the storm raged outside their shelter, a sense of justice as well. For in bringing these three souls together in his isolated cabin, it had created the possibility of healing wounds far older and deeper than any he had treated on the battlefield. Morning arrived with eerie silence, the storm having spent itself during the night. Thad, who had taken the final watch, eased the shutter open to reveal a transformed world. Pristine white snow, blanketing the landscape, pine boughs heavily laden the sky above, startlingly clear and blue. In the crystalline air, distant mountains stood out with unnatural sharpness, as if drawn by a meticulous hand. The beauty was deceptive. Thad knew that the deep snow would make travel difficult, particularly for Hannah and the injured Abigail. Yet, they couldn't remain at the cabin indefinitely. Their supplies were limited, and the longer they stayed, the greater the risk that Parker or his men would connect their disappearance with Conrad's secret retreat. Inside, Maggie was already awake, quietly preparing a simple breakfast from their provisions. Hannah still slept curled beneath blankets near the banked fire. Abigail sat propped against the wall, her face pale, but her eyes alert, watching Maggie with cautious interest. "How's the wound?" Thad asked, approaching Abigail and kneeling to check her bandages. "Painful," she admitted, "but I've had worse." Something in her tone, the matter-of-fact acceptance of suffering, reminded Thad of soldiers he'd treated, men who had learned to compartmentalize pain as simply another condition of existence. It was a disturbing quality to find in one so young. "Let me see," he insisted gently. Abigail allowed him to examine the wound, which showed no signs of infection, a fortunate circumstance given their limited medical supplies. Thad rebandaged it with clean cloth torn from one of Conrad's shirts, found in the cabin, his movements practiced and efficient. "You'll need to keep this clean and dry," he instructed. "And no strenuous activity for at least a week." Abigail's mouth quirked in a humorless smile. "I don't think our circumstances will allow for much rest, Doctor." "Perhaps not," Thad acknowledged, securing the bandage. "But we'll do what we can." Maggie joined them, offering a cup of hot coffee to each. "I've been thinking about our options," she said, keeping her voice low to avoid waking Hannah. "Abigail's suggestion about the telegraph office in Silver Creek may be our best chance." Thad nodded thoughtfully. "The snow will slow any pursuers as much as it slows us. If we can reach Silver Creek and get a message to the U.S. Marshal in Helena, my uncle and Sheriff Parker will be watching the main trails," Abigail cautioned. "They know these mountains well." "But not as well as someone who's lived in them for years," Thad countered. "There are ways through the high country that don't follow established trails, harder going but less likely to be watched." "Can Hannah manage such a journey?" Maggie asked, concern evident in her voice. "And Abigail with her injury?" "I'll manage," Abigail insisted stubbornly. "And the little one is stronger than she looks." Hannah stirred at that moment, sitting up and rubbing sleep from her eyes. "I'm very strong," she declared, having caught the end of the conversation. "Uncle Thad said so when I was sick." The three adults exchanged glances, their concern tempered by Hannah's innocent confidence. Thad made his decision. "We'll leave within the hour," he announced. "Silver Creek is approximately 8 miles north over difficult terrain. If we push hard, we can reach it by nightfall." Preparations were swift and practical. They gathered what supplies they could carry, focusing on essentials: food, medical items, the precious ledger, and weapons. Thad found a small sled in an outbuilding behind the cabin, likely used by Conrad for transporting game, which he modified to carry Hannah when the snow became too deep for her to walk. By mid-morning, they were ready. Thad took one last look around the cabin, ensuring they had left nothing essential behind, and no obvious signs of their presence. The ledger was secured inside his coat close to his body for safekeeping. "One last thing," he said, turning to Abigail. "Your uncle and Parker, how many men will they have searching?" "6 or 7, Abigail answered without hesitation. "Deputies mostly, but a few hired guns as well. My uncle doesn't trust the regular deputies with certain tasks." Thad absorbed this grim information with a nod. "And they're primarily watching the routes back to Clearwater and toward Helena." "Yes, they believe Mrs. Sinclair is trying to reach federal authorities with whatever evidence she has against them." "Which is exactly what we're trying to do," Maggie observed dryly, "just by a different route." Thad managed a tight smile. Sometimes the obvious plan executed unexpectedly is the most effective. He checked his rifle one last time, then turned to the door. "Stay close, conserve energy, and alert me at the first sign of trouble." The journey began well enough. The day remained clear, the sun reflecting brilliantly off the snow, warming the air despite the season. They followed the ridge northward, keeping to the tree line where the snow was less deep and their tracks less visible from below. Hannah alternated between walking and riding on the sled, her natural energy dampened somewhat by the challenging conditions, but her spirits remaining high. She chatted happily with Abigail, who despite her pain seemed to draw strength from the child's untroubled perspective. By midday, they had covered perhaps 3 miles slower progress than Thad had hoped for, but respectable given the circumstances. They paused in a sheltered hollow to rest and eat a cold meal, none of them willing to risk a fire that might betray their position. "Tell me about Daniel Hayes," Maggie said suddenly, breaking the silence that had fallen over their small group. "Hannah's father. What was he like?" Thad, who had been scanning the horizon for signs of pursuit, turned to her with surprise. It was the first time she had directly acknowledged the revelation of Hannah's true parentage. "Hayes was," he began, then paused, searching for words adequate to describe the man. "He was extraordinary. Brilliant, compassionate, stubborn as hell when he believed in something." A ghost of a smile touched Thad's lips. "He wasn't supposed to be at the Wilderness at all. He was a staff officer by then, assigned to headquarters. But when he learned his wife and daughter were in danger, their camp had been in the path of the Confederate advance, he rode out against direct orders to find them." Hannah had stopped eating, her attention captured by this story of the man who had been her father. "Did he find them?" she asked quietly. Thad met her eyes, those blue eyes so like Daniel's that it still startled him. "He found you," he said gently. "Your mother had already been killed in the shelling, but you were alive though injured. He carried you to our field hospital himself. And then he died too," Hannah concluded with a child's directness. Thad knotted his throat tight with old grief. "He was wounded during the rescue. He held on long enough to make sure you were safe, to ask me to protect you." He looked down at his hands, calloused and weathered. "A promise I've failed to keep until now." "You didn't fail," Maggie said unexpectedly. "You're keeping it now. And in between, I loved her as my own." She reached out to stroke Hannah's hair. "Perhaps that's how it was meant to be." The simple statement, offered without resentment or calculation, touched something deep in Thad's battered soul. Here was grace he had not expected, forgiveness he had not dared to hope for, from a woman who had every reason to guard her heart against further loss. "Thank you," he said simply, the words inadequate but sincere. Abigail, who had been listening to this exchange with thoughtful attention, spoke up. "So the little one is really Emma Hayes?" she asked. "The daughter of a Union officer?" "Yes," Thad confirmed. "Though she's been Hannah Sinclair for the past 2 years. Names matter less than the love that's been given." "Names matter to the law," Abigail pointed out practically. "And to those who might have claims on her." Maggie tensed visibly at this, but Thad shook his head. Daniel's parents were already deceased before the war. His wife Julia was an only child. There are no relatives with stronger claims than the woman who has raised her with love. He looked directly at Maggie. "The ledger proves the adoption was fraudulent. With my testimony about Daniel's wishes, I believe we can establish your guardianship legally." Hope and wariness warred in Maggie's expression. After a lifetime of having security snatched away, she was cautious about embracing new possibilities. "Let's reach Silver Creek first," she said finally. "One step at a time." They resumed their journey the afternoon, bringing colder temperatures as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains. The terrain grew more challenging, steep slopes and deep ravines that forced detours and slowed their progress. Hannah tired quickly now, spending most of her time on the sled that Thad pulled with stoic determination, despite the strain on his damaged leg. Abigail, too, was flagging her face, drawn with pain she tried to conceal. Maggie stayed close to her, offering an arm for support. On particularly difficult sections, their shared concern for Hannah creating an unspoken bond between them. By late afternoon, they had covered perhaps 6 miles, still 2 miles short of Silver Creek, with daylight fading rapidly. Thad called a halt at the edge of a small plateau that offered a panoramic view of the valley below. In the distance, they could just make out the thin column of smoke that marked Silver Creek, a small mining settlement nestled in a protected hollow. "We won't reach it before dark," Thad announced, studying the terrain ahead. "And traveling these slopes in darkness would be foolhardy." "So we make camp?" Maggie asked, glancing at Hannah's tired face and Abigail's pain-drawn features. Thad nodded reluctantly. "There's a stand of pines ahead that should offer some shelter. We'll stop there, rest until first light, then make the final push to Silver Creek." The small copse of pines proved to be more than just shelter. It concealed a natural hollow in the rock face, not quite a cave, but a shallow overhang that would block wind and reflect the heat of a small, carefully managed fire. Thad decided the risk of the fire was worth the warmth it would provide, especially for Hannah and Abigail. As darkness fell, they huddled in the relative comfort of their makeshift camp, a small fire, casting flickering light on weary faces. Hannah fell asleep almost immediately, exhausted from the day's exertions. Abigail, too, drifted into uneasy slumber, her body's need for healing overcoming the discomfort of their situation. Maggie and Thad remained awake, keeping watch in silent companionship. The night was clear, and cold stars pricking the black velvet of the sky with impossible brilliance. In the distance, a wolf howled, the sound echoing across the silent landscape. "I never thanked you properly," Maggie said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. "For taking us in that night, for helping Hannah, for everything since." Thad shook his head slightly. "No thanks needed. I did what anyone would do." "No," Maggie disagreed gently. "Not anyone. Most would have turned us away, or turned us in. You chose compassion over safety, healing over isolation. That's rare, especially in a world that's taught you to expect the worst from people." Thad was silent for a long moment, uncomfortable with her gratitude, yet moved by it. "Perhaps I was simply tired of being alone," he admitted finally. "Or perhaps I recognized something in you, a fellow survivor." Maggie's gaze remained on the fire, but a small smile touched her lips. "Fellow survivors, then? All of us in our own ways." She glanced at the sleeping forms of Hannah and Abigail, even the young ones who should never have had to learn such lessons so early. "Especially them," Thad agreed soberly. They fell silent again, each lost in private thoughts, as the fire burned low. After a while, Maggie spoke again, her voice different now, hesitant, almost vulnerable. "What happens after?" she asked. "If we succeed in reaching the marshal, in bringing Parker and the others to justice? What then?" The question caught Thad off guard. He had been so focused on immediate survival on the next necessary step that he had given little thought to what might follow. What would happen to Maggie and Hannah once they were safe? What would happen to him once his promise to Daniel was fulfilled at last? "I don't know," he admitted honestly. "I suppose you'd be free to go wherever you wished. Start fresh somewhere new with Hannah." "And you?" Maggie pressed gently. "Would you return to your cabin to solitude?" Thad stared into the dying embers, seeing in them the shape of the life he had built for himself after the war contained controlled safe. Empty. "I hadn't thought beyond keeping my promise," he said finally. "Beyond making sure you and Hannah were safe." "Perhaps," Maggie suggested carefully, "there might be a different path, for all of us." The implication hung in the air between them, delicate and uncertain as a soap bubble. Thad looked up from the fire to find Maggie watching him, her expression open and unguarded, in a way he had never seen before. "Maggie, he began, But whatever he might have said was lost, as Abigail suddenly sat up fully alert, despite having seemed deeply asleep moments before. "Someone's coming," she whispered urgently. "I heard voices." Instantly, Thad was on his feet, rifle in hand, all personal considerations forgotten. "How many? How close?" he demanded in a low voice. "At least 2, maybe more," Abigail replied, wincing as she shifted position. "Not far, just below the ridge." Thad moved to the edge of their shelter, listening intently. For a moment, he heard nothing but the soft sigh of wind through pine branches. Then carried on. The night air came the unmistakable sound of men's voices, distant yet but approaching steadily. "Wake Hannah," he instructed Maggie tersely. "Quietly. We need to move." Maggie complied without question, gently rousing her daughter while gathering their few belongings. Hannah blinked awake instantly, sensing the tension in the air and remaining silent as her mother had taught her during their months of flight. "Where can we go?" Abigail asked, struggling to her feet with Maggie's assistance. "The trail ahead is exposed for nearly half a mile." Thad considered their options, limited as they were. "Up," he decided grimly. "Above the tree line. They won't expect that in darkness." It was a desperate strategy. The slopes above their position were steep and treacherous, doubly so in darkness and snow. But the alternative, being caught in the open or trapped in their current position, was worse. Quickly, they extinguished the fire and obscured signs of their presence as best they could. Thad abandoned the sled, it would be useless on the steep incline ahead, and lifted Hannah onto his shoulders. "Hold tight," he murmured to her, "and not a sound, no matter what." The small party began their ascent, moving as silently as possible through the snow-laden pines and up the rocky slope beyond. The going was agonizingly slow, each step requiring careful placement to avoid loose stones or patches of ice that might send them sliding back down, or worse, trigger a small avalanche that would reveal their position. Abigail struggled visibly, her wound limiting her mobility, but she pressed on with grim determination, accepting Maggie's supporting arm without comment. Thad led the way, Hannah clinging to his shoulders with complete trust, her small body warm against his back. The voices below grew louder, then diverged. The searchers were spreading out, combing the area systematically. A lantern's glow appeared among the trees, swinging in slow arcs, as its bearer searched for tracks or signs of passage. "There!" came a sudden shout. "Footprints heading up!" Thad's heart sank. They had been spotted, or at least their trail had. "Move faster," he urged quietly. "Up to those rocks. We can make a stand there if needed." A formation of granite boulders loomed ahead, offering both cover and a defensible position. They had nearly reached it when a rifle shot cracked through the night, the bullet whining off rock uncomfortably close to Thad's head. Hannah stifled a cry, burying her face against his neck. "Down!" Thad ordered, dropping to a crouch behind the nearest boulder. Maggie and Abigail followed suit, pressing themselves against the cold stone as another shot rang out. "We know you're there, Remington," called a voice from below, familiar, filled with malicious satisfaction. "Joseph Thornton. And we know you have the Sinclair woman and the child. Come down now, and perhaps we can discuss terms." Thad said nothing, using the moment to settle Hannah safely between 2 boulders with Maggie beside her. He checked his rifle, then glanced at Abigail, who had pressed herself against the rock face, her expression a mixture of fear and defiance. "It's my uncle," she whispered unnecessarily. "He won't offer mercy no matter what he says." "I know," Thad replied grimly. He turned to Maggie. "Stay with Hannah. I'm going to try to draw them away, give you a chance to reach the summit. There's a trail on the other side that leads directly to Silver Creek." "No," Maggie protested immediately. "We stay together." "There's no time to argue," Thad insisted. "Thad, they've found us, and they won't stop until they have the ledger and anyone who knows what's in it." He reached inside his coat and withdrew the precious document, pressing it into Maggie's hands. "Take this. Get it to the marshal in Helena. That's what matters now." Before Maggie could protest further, another voice called up from the darkness, deeper, more authoritative than Thornton's. Sheriff Parker himself had joined the hunt. "Dr. Remington," he shouted, "I have 15 armed men surrounding this mountain. There's no escape. Surrender now, and I give you my word that no harm will come to the woman or child." "Your word means nothing, Parker," Thad called back, deliberately revealing his position to draw attention away from the others. "We know about the trafficking. We have Conrad's ledger. It's already been sent to federal authorities." A brief silence followed this bluff, then Parker's voice again, tighter now, with controlled fury. "You're lying, Remington. The passes have been blocked for days. No one's gotten through." "Telegraph works in any weather," Thad countered. He glanced at Maggie, mouthing silently, "Go now, while they're focused on me." Maggie shook her head stubbornly, unwilling to leave him. Beside her, Hannah clung to her mother, eyes wide with fear, but remarkably composed for a child her age. A new voice joined the conversation from below, younger, with an edge of desperation. "Abby, are you up there? It's Oliver. Please come down. They're saying you stole something important." Abigail stiffened at the voice recognition flashing across her features. "Oliver Preston," she whispered to Thad. "A boy from town. He cares for me. My uncle must be using him." "Abby, please," the young voice called again. "They just want to talk. No one needs to get hurt." Conflict warred in Abigail's expression, concern for this Oliver weighing against her knowledge of her uncle's true nature. "He doesn't understand," she murmured. "He doesn't know what they're really like." "Don't answer," Thad advised quietly. "It's a trap to draw you out." Below, the lanterns had stopped moving their bearers, apparently waiting for a response. The silence stretched taut as a bowstring. Then, from farther down the slope, came an unexpected sound. The heavy crack of a rifle, different from the lighter weapons Parker's men carried. It was followed immediately by a shout of pain and confusion. "What the hell?" Parker's voice cut off by another shot. More gunfire erupted, but not directed at their position on the rocks. Instead, it seemed to be an exchange between Parker's group and unknown assailants below. "Ambush!" someone yelled, followed by the sounds of men scrambling for cover. Orders shouted in confusion, more shots fired in rapid succession. Thad, as bewildered as the others, cautiously peered around the boulder. In the faint light of the dropped lanterns he could make out figures in motion, diving behind trees and rocks, as rifle fire continued from the darkness beyond. "What's happening?" Maggie whispered, holding Hannah protectively close. "I don't know," Thad admitted, "but someone's attacking Parker's men. This might be our only chance. We need to move now." Without waiting for further discussion, he lifted Hannah into his arms and began to climb again, heading for the summit with renewed urgency. Maggie supported Abigail, the four of them, scrambling upward as the firefight continued below, providing unexpected cover for their escape. They reached the summit just as dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, casting long shadows across the snow-covered peaks. Beyond, as Thad had promised, a clear trail led downward toward the distant smoke of Silver Creek. "Who would attack Parker's men?" Maggie asked, as they paused to catch their breath, the sounds of conflict now fading behind them. "Who even knew we were here?" "Perhaps we have allies we didn't know about," Thad suggested, setting Hannah down gently. "Or perhaps It's simply another faction looking for the ledger. Either way, it's bought us time and distance. They started down the trail, moving as quickly as Abigail's injury and Hannah's short legs would allow. The descent was easier than the climb had been, the path well-defined and relatively free of obstacles. By mid-morning, the small mining settlement of Silver Creek came fully into view, smoke rising from multiple chimneys, the sounds of activity carrying faintly on the clear air. "The telegraph office is near the center of town," Abigail informed them, her face pale with exhaustion, but her spirit unbroken. "Mr. Jenkins lives above it. He's a good man. He helped me once, when my uncle was in one of his rages." Thad nodded, formulating a plan. "Maggie, you and Hannah wait at the edge of town. Abigail and I will go to Jenkins, see if he'll send a message to the marshal in Helena. If anything seems wrong, we'll withdraw immediately." "I should come with you," Maggie protested. "The ledger is safer with you for now," Thad interrupted gently. "If Parker's influence reaches here, or if he has men watching the town, you and Hannah are the ones most at risk. Please trust me in this." After a moment's hesitation, Maggie nodded reluctantly. "1 hour," she stipulated. "If you're not back by then, we'll assume something's wrong and make our own way to Helena." "Fair enough," Thad agreed, impressed as always by her practical courage. He turned to Hannah, crouching to her level. "You stay with your mama, little one. Be brave and quiet, just as you have been." Hannah nodded solemnly, then surprised him by throwing her small arms around his neck in a quick, fierce hug. "Be careful, Uncle Thad," she whispered. "The bad men are still coming." The simple, childish warning sent a chill through Thad that had nothing to do with the winter air. Hannah's intuition had proven eerily accurate before. "I will," he promised, returning her embrace awkwardly before rising. He and Abigail left Maggie and Hannah in a sheltered copse of pines at the town's edge, then made their way cautiously into Silver Creek. The settlement was small, perhaps 30 buildings clustered around a single main street, with mine entrances visible on the hillside beyond. People moved about their business, paying little attention to the newcomers. The telegraph office was easy to find, a small building with the distinctive wire running from its roof. Thad approached it warily, scanning the street for any sign of Parker's men or unusual attention. Seeing nothing alarming, he ushered Abigail inside. The office was warm and smelled of pipe tobacco and oiled metal. A counter divided the space, behind which sat a middle-aged man with spectacles and a neatly trimmed beard. He looked up from his equipment as they entered, recognition flashing in his eyes as he saw Abigail. "Miss Thornton," he greeted her, rising from his stool, "this is unexpected." And his gaze shifted to Thad, noting the military bearing, the scarred hands, the slight unevenness in his stance. "You must be Dr. Remington. Your reputation precedes you." Thad tensed slightly at this acknowledgement. "You know who I am." "Word travels," Jenkins replied calmly, "especially when Sheriff Parker puts out alerts to watch for certain individuals." He gestured to a paper tacked to the wall behind him, a crude description of Thad, Maggie, and Hannah with the notation, "Armed and dangerous. Report sightings immediately." "Are you going to report us, then?" Thad asked quietly, his hand drifting toward the pistol concealed beneath his coat. Jenkins smiled thinly. "That depends on why you're here, Doctor, and on whether your presence might finally provide the opportunity to address certain long-standing concerns about the sheriff's activities." Abigail stepped forward, wincing slightly as the movement pulled at her wound. "Mr. Jenkins has no love for my uncle or Sheriff Parker," she explained to Thad. "His brother disappeared 3 years ago after asking too many questions about missing shipments." Jenkins nodded gravely. "Jacob was always too curious for his own good. But he wasn't wrong about what he suspected. He studied them both for a moment, then came to a decision. "Come through to the back. It's more private, and you look like you could use some coffee and a proper rest." He lifted a section of the counter, allowing them to pass into the telegraph operator's private domain. Beyond was a small living area, a stove, a table with chairs, a narrow bed in one corner. Jenkins gestured for them to sit, then busied himself preparing coffee. "You have the ledger, I assume?" he asked without preamble. "Conrad Sinclair's record of the trafficking operation." Thad exchanged a quick glance with Abigail. "What makes you think that Parker's men have been tearing the territory apart looking for it since Sinclair died?" Jenkins replied matter-of-factly. "And suddenly, you appear the notorious Dr. Remington, the fugitive Mrs. Sinclair, and the child Parker seems particularly interested in recovering. It doesn't require a detective's skills to connect these facts." "Yes," Thad admitted after a moment's consideration. "We have the ledger, and we need to get word to the U.S. Marshal in Helena." Jenkins nodded unsurprised. "I can send a telegraph. Marshal Davis has been investigating Parker for months, but without solid evidence, his hands have been tied. The territorial governor is a friend of Parker's, you see." "Politics," Thad muttered disgustedly. "Always," Jenkins agreed, pouring coffee into chipped mugs. "But the marshal is a good man. If you have concrete evidence, he'll move heaven and earth to act on it." Thad accepted the coffee gratefully, the warmth and caffeine reviving his exhausted body. "We need to bring Mrs. Sinclair and her daughter into town," he said. "They're waiting at the edge of the settlement. But if Parker has men watching—" "He does," Jenkins confirmed grimly. "Two of his deputies arrived yesterday ostensibly to deliver messages. They've been watching the trails and the telegraph office." "Then how do we get a message out without them knowing?" Abigail asked, frustration evident in her voice. Jenkins smiled, revealing unexpected craftiness in his scholarly face. "The official telegraph line runs south to Helena," he explained. "But I've maintained a private line running north to Fort Harrison for emergencies." "A private line?" Thad repeated, surprised. "Is that legal?" "Technically, no," Jenkins admitted. "But after my brother disappeared, I thought it prudent to have communication options beyond Parker's control." He sipped his coffee thoughtfully. "I can send your message to the fort, and they can relay it to Helena. It will take longer, but Parker's men won't know it's been sent." Thad felt a surge of hope, the first real chance they'd had since finding the ledger. "And Mrs. Sinclair and Hannah, how do we bring them safely into town?" Jenkins considered this, stroking his beard. "There's a mining supply store at the edge of town run by the widow Chen. Her late husband was one of the first to suspect Parker's involvement in disappearances along the railroad. She maintains a room above her shop where she's sheltered others in similar circumstances." "Can we trust her?" Thad asked, caution, born of hard experience, making him wary of expanding their circle of confidants. "With your lives," Jenkins assured him. "She lost everything because of Parker and his operation. Her husband, her respectability, nearly her business. She's been waiting for a chance at justice for years." The plan came together quickly after that. Jenkins would compose and send the message to Fort Harrison, providing details of the ledger's contents and their situation. Meanwhile, Abigail would guide Thad to the widow Chen's shop, where they would arrange safe shelter for Maggie and Hannah until the marshal could respond. As they prepared to leave, Jenkins placed a hand on Thad's arm. "One more thing you should know," he said soberly. "There's talk in town of a shooting in the mountains last night. A group of miners returning from a new claim up north encountered armed men on the trail and exchanged gunfire." "Miners," Thad repeated, understanding dawning. "They were the ones who attacked Parker's men." Jenkins nodded. Accidentally, it seems. They thought they were being ambushed by claim jumpers. But it may have saved your lives, Doctor. Providence works in unexpected ways, Thad observed dryly. Let's hope it continues to favor us. They left the telegraph office, cautiously keeping to side streets as Jenkins had advised. The Widow Chen's shop was easy to find, a sturdy building with a distinctive red door set slightly apart from the other businesses. A hand-painted sign in both English and Chinese characters identified it as Chen Family Mining Supplies. A small bell chimed as they entered the interior, dim after the bright snow-reflected sunlight outside. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with tools, ropes, lanterns, and other equipment necessary for the mining operations that sustained Silver Creek. Behind a counter at the rear stood a small woman with iron-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun, her face lined, but her dark eyes sharp and assessing. "Mrs. Chen," Thad inquired, approaching the counter. "Mr. Jenkins sent us." The woman's gaze flicked between them, taking in Abigail's pallor and the way she favored her injured side, Thad's military bearing and watchful eyes. "You are the ones Parker seeks," she stated flatly. It wasn't a question. "Yeah," Thad admitted, seeing no point in denial. "We have evidence of his crimes, and we have a woman and child who need shelter until the marshal can respond to our message." Mrs. Chen's expression didn't change, but something in her posture shifted, a subtle relaxation perhaps, or a decision made. "Where are they?" she asked simply. "In the pines at the north edge of town," Thad replied. "Waiting for our signal that it's safe." Mrs. Chen nodded once, then moved from behind the counter with unexpected swiftness for a woman of her years. She locked the front door, turned the sign to "closed," and gestured for them to follow her to a back room. "My son will bring them," she announced, leading them into a storage area piled with crates and sacks. "He knows the trails that avoid Parker's watchers." A young man looked up from where he had been inventorying supplies, tall and lean, with his mother's sharp eyes, but a gentler countenance. Mrs. Chen spoke to him rapidly in Chinese, and he nodded immediately, setting aside his ledger and reaching for a coat. "Lee will find them," Mrs. Chen assured Thad. "Meanwhile, the girl needs rest and proper treatment for her wound." She had clearly noted Abigail's condition despite their brief interaction. "And you, doctor, look as though you haven't slept properly in days." Thad couldn't argue with this assessment. The combination of their arduous journey, the confrontation on the mountain, and the constant vigilance required by their situation had drained him to the point of near collapse. Only determination and years of military discipline had kept him functioning. "There will be time for rest when they're safe," he said stubbornly, "Mrs." Chen made a small dismissive sound in the back of her throat. "Men," she muttered. "Always believing strength means refusing to acknowledge human needs." Nevertheless, she led them up a narrow staircase to the living quarters above the shop. The space was modest, but meticulously maintained a main room with a stove table and chairs. 2 small bedrooms visible through partially open doors. Everything was clean, orderly, with touches of beauty in unexpected places, a delicately painted vase, embroidered cushions, a scroll of Chinese calligraphy on one wall. "The girl will rest here," Mrs. Chen decided, gesturing to one of the bedrooms. "You, doctor, will sit and eat something while we wait for Lee to return with the others." Her tone brooked no argument, reminding Thad of the battlefield nurses who had managed to maintain order and routine even in the chaos of war. He helped Abigail to the indicated bedroom, checked her bandages one more time, then followed Mrs. Chen's instructions to sit at the table where she placed before him a bowl of fragrant broth and a plate of dumplings. "Eat," she commanded. "Then tell me everything about this evidence you carry and what Parker has done to deserve his downfall." As Thad ate the food simple but delicious after days of cold trail rations, he provided a concise account of their journey, the discovery of Conrad's ledger, and its damning contents. Mrs. Chen listened without interruption, her face impassive, save for a tightening around her eyes when he mentioned the trafficking of women. "My husband suspected this," she said when he had finished. He saw patterns in the supply orders, large purchases for mining camps that employed few actual miners. Equipment better suited to restraint than extraction. Her voice remained steady, but her hands folded on the table before her betrayed tension in their whitened knuckles. When he began asking questions, Parker arranged an accident at the Lucky Strike mine. 17 men died, including Chen Bao. "I'm sorry," Thad said quietly, understanding now the depth of her commitment to their cause. Mrs. Chen acknowledged this with a slight inclination of her head. "Sorrow changes nothing. Action brings justice. That is why I help those Parker would harm." She rose, gathering his empty dishes. "Rest now. Lee will return soon with your companions." Despite his intention to remain alert, Thad found himself dozing at the table, exhaustion finally overcoming even his iron will. He was awakened by the sound of the back door opening, followed by hushed voices and the patter of small feet on the wooden floor. "Uncle Thad," Hannah's voice bright with relief. "We found you." Thad opened his eyes to see the child rushing toward him, her face alight with joy despite the ordeal of the past days. Behind her came Maggie, accompanied by Mrs. Chen's son, all three snow-dusted and rosy-cheeked from the cold. "You're safe," Thad said, gathering Hannah into an embrace that felt as natural as if he'd been doing it all his life. "Thank God." Maggie approached more slowly, her eyes taking in the room Mrs. Chen the evidence of safe harbor. "Mr. Jenkins's message," she asked without preamble. "Was he able to send it?" "Yes," Thad confirmed, setting Hannah down, but keeping a hand on her shoulder. "To Fort Harrison, who will relay it to Helena. And we have shelter here until the marshal responds." Relief washed over Maggie's features, followed quickly by caution. "How long will that take?" "A day, perhaps 2. Thad estimated, depending on the weather and how quickly the marshal can organize a response. "Parker's men are still searching the northern trails," Lee reported, removing his snow-covered coat. "But they haven't extended their watch to the eastern approach I used to bring Mrs. Sinclair and the child in." Mrs. Chen nodded approvingly at her son, then turned to Maggie. "You are welcome here," she said simply. "My home is your sanctuary until justice is done." Maggie inclined her head respectfully. "Thank you. Your kindness to strangers is extraordinary." "Not strangers," Mrs. Chen corrected. "Allies in a common cause." She gestured to the bedroom opposite the one where Abigail now slept. "You and the child will rest there. I will prepare a proper meal. Then we will make plans for what comes next." As Mrs. Chen bustled about her kitchen, Maggie drew Thad aside, her voice low with urgency. "The ledger," she whispered. "It's still safe." Thad nodded. "You have it." Maggie patted her coat where the precious document was concealed. "I haven't let it out of my possession. But Thad—" She hesitated, glancing at Hannah, who was now chatting animatedly with Lee, seemingly unaffected by the danger that still surrounded them. "What if Parker finds us before the marshal arrives? What if the message doesn't get through?" "It will," Thad assured her, trying to project more confidence than he felt. "And Parker would have to know exactly where to look in Silver Creek. The town may be small, but there are many places a woman and child could be hidden." Maggie's eyes met his, unconvinced. "He found us on the mountain in the middle of nowhere. And Providence intervened," Thad reminded her. "As Jenkins believes, It will again. I don't share his faith in Providence, Maggie said softly. But I do believe in you, Thad, in what you've done for us, what you continue to do despite the risk to yourself. The simple declaration struck Thad deeply, resonating with emotions he had long suppressed: the need to be useful, to protect, to fulfill the promises he had made both to Daniel Hayes and, more recently, to Maggie herself. "We've come this far together," he said, his voice rough with feeling. "We'll see it through to the end, whatever that may be." Maggie held his gaze for a long moment, something unspoken but profound passing between them. Then she nodded, accepting his assurance, and moved to join Hannah and Lee in their conversation. Thad watched her go, struck again by her resilience, her quiet strength in the face of circumstances that would have broken many. In the short time since she had appeared at his cabin door, she had transformed his solitary existence, challenging his self-imposed exile, and reminding him that life offered more than mere survival. Whatever came next, whether justice or further trials, he knew with sudden clarity that he could not return to the empty life he had built for himself after the war. The cabin that had been his refuge now seemed a prison. The solitude that had been his comfort, now revealed as a slow death of the spirit. Maggie and Hannah had changed that awakening parts of himself he had thought long dead. And whatever the outcome of their current struggle, he was determined to honor that awakening, to live fully again, not merely exist. With that resolution firm in his mind, Thad joined the others at the table, ready to face whatever challenges the coming days might bring. Night fell over Silver Creek, bringing with it a tense quiet. Mrs. Chen's upstairs rooms became a haven of warmth and momentary safety, the smell of cooking filling the space as she prepared a proper meal for her unexpected guests. Hannah had fallen asleep on a cushioned bench, exhausted by the day's events, but peaceful in the security of their shelter. Abigail, too, rested more comfortably, her wound cleaned and rebandaged, with Mrs. Chen's expert assistance. Thad stood at the small window that overlooked the main street, watching for any unusual activity that might signal Parker's men had traced them to Silver Creek. So far, the settlement appeared normal miners returning from their shifts. The saloon at the far end growing rowdier as evening deepened, occasional travelers moving between buildings with the hurried pace of those eager to escape the winter cold. "Anything?" Maggie asked quietly, joining him at the window. "Nothing concerning," Thad replied. "The usual evening activities of a mining town. No sign of Parker or his deputies." "That's something, at least." Maggie's shoulder brushed against his as she peered out, the casual contact sending an unexpected warmth through Thad's tired body. "Jenkins believes the marshal will respond quickly once he receives our message." Thad said, more to distract himself from her proximity than from any need to repeat information she already knew. "Apparently, he's been building a case against Parker for months. And now we've handed him the evidence he needs," Maggie concluded, her tone holding both satisfaction and wariness. "I only hope it's enough. The ledger details years of trafficking with names, dates, amounts paid," Thad reminded her. "And with our testimony and Abigail's, the case becomes even stronger." Maggie nodded, but her expression remained troubled. "I keep thinking about Hannah," she admitted softly, "about what the ledger reveals about her past, about Emma Hayes." Thad turned from the window to face her fully. "Does it change how you feel about her?" he asked gently. "No," Maggie answered without hesitation. "She's my daughter, in every way that matters, but I worry about what it means legally. If her adoption wasn't valid, if there are relatives somewhere with stronger claims—" "Daniel Hayes had no living relatives when he died," Thad assured her, "and his last request was that I find Emma and keep her safe. You've done that, Maggie. You've been the mother she needed when I failed to find her." "And now," Maggie pressed, "when this is over, if we succeed in bringing Parker to justice, what then? Will you claim her as Daniel's chosen guardian? The question hung between them, weighted with implications for all their futures. Thad considered his answer carefully, aware of its importance. I would never separate Hannah from the only mother she knows, he said finally. Whatever legal arrangements might be made, they would recognize your role in her life first and foremost. Relief softened Maggie's features, but uncertainty lingered in her eyes. And your role, would you simply return to your cabin, your solitude? It was the same question she had asked on the mountain before they were interrupted, a question that probed at possibilities neither had dared to articulate fully. I don't think I can, Thad admitted quietly, return to that life. It was incomplete, empty in ways I didn't fully recognize until Maggie prompted when he hesitated. Until you and Hannah arrived, Thad finished simply, until I was reminded that isolation isn't the same as peace. Something shifted in Maggie's expression, a softening, a hope carefully contained. Before she could respond, however, Mrs. Chen called them to the table where she had laid out a meal of surprising abundance, given the circumstances, soup rich with vegetables and dumplings, rice and tea, fragrant with unfamiliar spices. Eat, she instructed in the same tone she might use with recalcitrant children. Strength comes from proper nourishment, not from worry and watching at windows. They obeyed, joined by Lee, who had returned from scouting the town's perimeter. Abigail, roused by the smell of food, joined them as well, moving stiffly but with more color in her cheeks than earlier. The meal passed in relative quiet, each lost in their own thoughts about what the coming days might bring. Hannah slept on, undisturbed by the soft murmur of conversation or the occasional clink of spoons against bowls. As Mrs. Chen cleared the dishes assisted by Lee, despite his mother's protests that guests should rest, a soft knock sounded at the back door, a specific pattern of taps that caused both Chen family members to relax rather than tense. Jenkins, Lee explained, moving to answer it. That's his signal. The telegraph operator entered quickly, stamping snow from his boots and unwinding a scarf from his neck. His expression was grave, his movements hurried. News, Thad asked immediately, rising from the table. Jenkins nodded, accepting the cup of tea Mrs. Chen pressed into his cold hands. The marshal received our message and is assembling a force to apprehend Parker and his associates. They should reach Silver Creek by tomorrow evening. Relief swept through the room, but Jenkins raised a hand to temper it. There's more, he continued soberly. Parker's men have been asking questions in town, specific questions about a doctor traveling with a woman and child. Someone has talked. Who? Maggie asked, alarm replacing her momentary relief. Unclear, Jenkins replied, sipping his tea. But they're focusing their search on the north end of town. It's only a matter of time before they think to check here. Then we need to move, Thad decided immediately. Find another hiding place until the marshal arrives. Mrs. Chen shook her head firmly. Moving in darkness with a child and an injured girl would draw attention. Better to strengthen our position here and prepare for the possibility of unwelcome visitors. She's right, Lee agreed. The shop has a hidden cellar accessed through the storeroom. It was used during the early mining conflicts to hide workers from company enforcers. If necessary, you could conceal yourselves there. And if they search the building? Thad pressed, unconvinced. The entrance is well disguised, Lee assured him, and we would have warning before any search began. I have friends watching Parker's men ready to signal if they move in this direction. A soft sound from the bench drew their attention. Hannah awake now and listening with solemn attention to the adult conversation. Are the bad men coming here? She asked quietly. Maggie moved immediately to her daughter's side, smoothing her tousled hair. "No one's coming here, sweetheart," she soothed. "We're just being careful, making plans." Hannah studied her mother's face with that unnervingly perceptive gaze. "You're worried," she stated simply. "I can tell." "A little," Maggie admitted, honesty winning out over the instinct to shield her child from reality. "But we have friends helping us now, and the marshal, like a special kind of sheriff, is coming to make sure the bad men can't hurt anyone anymore." Hannah considered this, then nodded as if satisfied. "Good. Uncle Thad is tired of running. His leg hurts, even though he doesn't say so." Thad, caught off guard by the child's observation, found himself the center of attention as all eyes turned to him. "I'm fine," he said gruffly. "The cold aggravates old injuries, that's all." Mrs. Chen made a small, knowing sound. "The child sees truly," she remarked, "as children often do." She moved to a cabinet and extracted a small ceramic jar. "An ointment for joint pain. My husband found it effective after his mining injuries." Before Thad could protest, she pressed the jar into his hands, her expression brooking no argument. He accepted it with awkward thanks, unused to such concern for his comfort after years of solitary endurance. "Now," Jenkins said, returning to the practical matters at hand, "we should prepare for all contingencies. If Parker's men do come here, you'll need to move quickly to the cellar. The ledger must be protected at all costs. It's the key to the entire case." "I'll show you the entrance now," Lee offered, "so there's no confusion if we need to use it in haste." The hidden cellar proved to be ingeniously concealed a section of storeroom flooring that pivoted smoothly when a particular shelf was adjusted in a specific way. Below was a small but clean space originally used for storing contraband during Prohibition, but later repurposed as a hiding place during labor disputes at the mines. "Not comfortable," Lee acknowledged, "but secure. And there's a secondary exit that leads to the alley behind the shop, if escape becomes necessary." They returned upstairs to continue their preparations, the knowledge of the hiding place providing some comfort, but the tension remaining palpable. Jenkins departed after extracting promises that they would follow Mrs. Chen and Lee's instructions in his absence. "I'll return at first light with any news," he assured them. "The marshal's men are moving as quickly as possible." After his departure, Mrs. Chen insisted they all try to rest. "Tomorrow may require strength and clear minds," she pointed out practically. "Sleep now while you can." Arrangements were made. Maggie and Hannah in one bedroom, Abigail continuing to occupy the other, while Thad and Lee would take turns keeping watch from the main room. Mrs. Chen herself refused to alter her routine, claiming her own bed in a small alcove off the kitchen area. "I've lived through more dangerous nights than this," she informed them crisply when Maggie expressed concern. "Sleep comes easily to those who have made peace with all possibilities." Despite the tension, exhaustion soon claimed most of the household. Thad took the first watch, stationed near the window with a clear view of the approach to the shop. Lee provided him with a loaded rifle, "for emergencies only," he cautioned before retiring to a pallet near the stove. The hours passed slowly, marked only by the soft ticking of a clock on the mantel and the occasional sounds from the street below, drunken miners making their way home, the distant whinny of horses, the creak of buildings settling in the cold. Thad's mind wandered as he kept his vigil, reviewing the extraordinary series of events that had led to this moment. Just days ago, he had been alone in his cabin, committed to his isolation, convinced that solitude was the appropriate penance for his perceived failures. Now he sat guard over a woman and child who had become inexplicably precious to him, involved in a dangerous conspiracy to bring down a corrupt sheriff, reunited with the daughter of his closest friend. through a twist of fate too remarkable to be coincidence. And through it all, something had awakened within him, something he had believed dead since the war, since the court-martial, since the loss of his leg, and his faith in humanity. Hope, purpose, perhaps even the capacity for joy. His reverie was interrupted by a soft footfall behind him. Turning, he found Maggie approaching, wrapped in a shawl. Mrs. Chen had provided her hair loose around her shoulders in a way he had never seen before. "I couldn't sleep," she explained quietly, joining him at the window. "Too many thoughts." "You should rest while you can," Thad advised, though he was grateful for her company. "Tomorrow may be challenging." "I've learned to function on little sleep," Maggie replied with a small smile. "It's a skill most mothers acquire." They stood in companionable silence for a time, watching the deserted street below. Snow had begun to fall again, large flakes drifting lazily in the pools of light cast by the town's few street lamps. "I've been thinking about what happens after," Maggie said, finally echoing their earlier conversation. "If we succeed, if Parker is arrested, and the trafficking operation exposed." "What have you decided?" Thad asked, genuinely curious about her plans. Maggie turned from the window to face him, her expression earnest in the dim light. "That depends in part on you," she said simply. Thad's breath caught at the directness of her statement. "On me, yes." Maggie's gaze was steady, though he could sense the vulnerability beneath her composure. "Hannah needs stability, a home, a future secure from the shadows of the past. I can provide much of that, but—" She hesitated, then continued with quiet determination. "She's grown attached to you, Thad. As have I." The admission hung between them both, an offering and a question. Thad found himself at a loss for words, emotions he had long suppressed rising to the surface with unexpected force. "Maggie, he began, but was interrupted by a sharp, urgent knock at the back door. Not Jenkins's rhythmic signal, but a rapid, insistent pounding that instantly brought Lee awake and alert. Who could— Maggie started, alarm replacing the openness of moments before. Lee was already moving toward the door, pistol in hand. "Stay back," he warned in a whisper, "and be ready to use the cellar if needed." Thad positioned himself between the door and Maggie, rifle raised, as Lee cautiously approached the entrance. "Who's there?" he called, his voice deliberately gruff. "Oliver Preston," came the urgent reply. "Please, I need to speak with Abigail. It's a matter of life and death." The name registered immediately the young man who had called to Abigail during the confrontation on the mountain. Thad and Lee exchanged wary glances, both suspecting a trap. "How did you find this place?" Lee demanded through the closed door. "Mr. Jenkins told me," the voice replied desperately. "Please, Sheriff Parker and Joseph Thornton are planning to burn the north end of town at dawn to flush you out. They know you're somewhere in Silver Creek." This alarming news galvanized them into action. Lee unbolted the door, keeping his pistol trained on the entrance as he opened it just enough to verify the visitor's identity. A young man stumbled in, perhaps 18 or 19, his face flushed with cold and exertion, snow dusting his coat and hat. He was unarmed, his hands raised to show peaceful intentions, his expression a mixture of fear and determination. "Where's Abigail?" he demanded immediately. "Is she safe? Thornton's been saying terrible things, that she stole something valuable, that she's involved with fugitives." "I'm here, Oliver," came Abigail's voice from the bedroom doorway. She stood leaning against the frame, pale but composed, her eyes softening at the sight of the young man. "And yes, I'm safe, thanks to these people." Oliver's relief was palpable, but short-lived, as he remembered his urgent message. "You all need to leave. he insisted, turning to include Thad and the others in his warning. Parker's gathered his men at the saloon. They're planning to set fires at dawn, create chaos, smoke you out. They know you're in the north end of town somewhere. How do you know this? Thad asked, still suspicious despite the young man's obvious distress. I work at the livery, Oliver explained rapidly. Parker's men stable their horses there. I overheard them talking while they thought I was busy with the animals. They didn't know that Abigail and I. He flushed, glancing at her with undisguised devotion. He's telling the truth, Abigail confirmed, moving carefully into the room. Oliver wouldn't betray us. He's been my only friend in Clearwater since my mother died. Mrs. Chen had emerged from her sleeping alcove, immediately grasping the situation. If they plan to burn buildings, we cannot stay, she decided briskly. Too many innocent people would be endangered. But where can we go? Maggie asked, her arm instinctively around Hannah, who had awakened at the commotion, and joined them, sleepy-eyed but alert to the tension. The marshal won't arrive until tomorrow evening. The mine, Lee suggested after a moment's thought. The old Fletcher shaft. It was abandoned last year after a minor collapse, but the entrance and first level are still stable. Few people go there now. A mine? Thad repeated doubtfully, with a child and an injured girl. It's dry and relatively warm, being partially underground, Lee explained. And there are still supplies, their lanterns, blankets. Most importantly, it's the last place Parker would think to look for you. Oliver nodded eagerly. He's right. The Fletcher shaft is up the eastern slope away from town. I could guide you there. I worked it for a season before moving to the livery. Thad looked to Maggie, leaving the decision in her hands as the one with the most at stake. She considered briefly, then nodded. We can't risk staying here, not if Parker is willing to endanger the entire town to find us. And we only need to hide until the marshal arrives. Then it's settled, Thad declared. We'll move to the mine immediately, while darkness still provides cover. Preparations were made with military efficiency, essential supplies, gathered warm clothing, distributed a plan formulated for reaching the mine without being observed. Mrs. Chen insisted on sending food and medical supplies, packing them into rucksacks for each adult to carry. My son will remain in town, she decided, to monitor Parker's movements and guide the marshal to you when he arrives. Lee agreed to this plan, adding, I'll send word to Jenkins as well. He can adjust his instructions to the marshal accordingly. Within half an hour, they were ready to depart. The night had deepened, the snowfall increasing in intensity, a mixed blessing that would cover their tracks but make travel more challenging. We'll go in pairs, spaced a few minutes apart, Thad instructed. Oliver, you'll lead with Abigail. Maggie and Hannah will follow. I'll come last to ensure we're not tracked. Be careful, Mrs. Chen admonished, pressing a small cloth bundle into Thad's hands. Herbs for tea and for pain if needed. The mine will be cold despite Lee's assurances. Thad accepted the gift with genuine gratitude, moved by the woman's practical kindness. Thank you, he said simply, for everything. Mrs. Chen inclined her head in acknowledgement, then turned to Maggie and Hannah. To the child, she presented a small carved wooden figure, a horse exquisitely detailed despite its tiny size. For courage, she explained, the horse spirit is strong and swift. Hannah accepted the gift with solemn appreciation, tucking it carefully into her coat pocket. Thank you, she said politely. I'll be brave like a horse. I know you will, little one, Mrs. Chen replied, with unexpected gentleness. To Maggie she added quietly, the child has an old soul. Cherish her wisdom as well as her innocence. Maggie nodded, tears threatening, despite her determination to remain strong. I will, she promised. "And thank you for believing us, for helping when you had no obligation to do so." "Justice creates its own obligations," Mrs. Chen replied simply. "Now go quickly. Dawn is still hours away, but the night has eyes of its own." They departed through the back entrance, Oliver and Abigail first slipping into the snowy darkness with cautious steps. 5 minutes later, Maggie and Hannah followed the child, walking bravely beside her mother, despite the late hour and difficult conditions. Thad waited the prescribed interval, then made his own exit after a final exchange with Lee about signals and rendezvous plans. The night engulfed him immediately, the falling snow creating a world of muffled sounds and indistinct shapes. He moved carefully, rifle ready, all senses alert for any sign of Parker's men. The route to the abandoned mine led them through the eastern edge of town, then up a gradually steepening slope where pine trees provided additional cover. Thad caught occasional glimpses of Maggie and Hannah ahead, maintaining their pace admirably despite the challenging terrain. Beyond them, Oliver and Abigail were barely visible shadows in the swirling snow. They had nearly reached the tree line, leaving the last buildings of Silver Creek behind, when a shout rang out from somewhere to their right, followed immediately by the crack of a rifle shot. The bullet whined harmlessly into the trees, but its message was clear: they had been spotted. "Run!" Thad shouted, abandoning stealth for speed. To the trees. Ahead he saw Maggie sweep Hannah into her arms and break into a run, Oliver supporting Abigail, as they too increased their pace. The mine entrance was still a quarter-mile ahead, up the increasingly steep slope, exposed ground they would need to cross under potential fire. Another shot rang out closer this time. Thad risked a glance back and saw shadowy figures in pursuit, 3 or 4 men moving rapidly despite the snow and darkness. "Parker's men," he muttered grimly, recognizing the tactical approach of trained manhunters rather than ordinary townspeople. He paused briefly behind the trunk of a massive pine, took careful aim at the snow between the pursuers, and fired a warning shot that kicked up a spray of white powder. The men scattered momentarily, slowing their advance. Thad used the opportunity to continue upward, pushing his damaged body to its limits as he climbed the slope toward where Maggie had paused at the tree line, unwilling to proceed without him. "Go!" and he urged as he reached her. "I'll hold them off." "Not without you," Maggie insisted, shifting Hannah to her other hip. "We stay together." There was no time to argue. More shouts came from below, and the distinctive metallic click of rifles being readied. Thad took Maggie's arm, and together they pushed through the final stretch of forest toward the dark opening in the mountainside that marked the Fletcher mine. Oliver and Abigail had already reached it, the young man waving urgently for them to hurry. As they approached, Oliver disappeared briefly into the mine entrance, returning moments later with a lit lantern that cast a warm glow on the snow-covered ground. "Inside quickly," he urged, helping Maggie negotiate the somewhat treacherous entrance with Hannah still in her arms. "There's a chamber about 50 yards in where we can defend if necessary." Thad ushered them all ahead of him, then paused at the entrance, listening intently. The sounds of pursuit continued, but more distant now. Their pursuers were being cautious, perhaps wary of ambush in the unfamiliar terrain. "How many ways in?" Thad asked Oliver as he finally entered the mine, the sudden absence of wind and snow almost disorienting in its stillness. "Just this main entrance," Oliver replied, leading them deeper into the tunnel. There was a ventilation shaft, but it collapsed in the same incident that closed the mine. That's why the air is still good. Natural fissures in the rock provide ventilation. The tunnel was surprisingly spacious, its walls reinforced with timber supports, the floor relatively even despite the mine's abandonment. Oliver's lantern cast jumping shadows as they moved deeper, the air growing noticeably warmer as they left the winter night behind. After perhaps 100 yards, the tunnel opened into a larger chamber where mining equipment still stood, ore carts, picks, shovels, and other tools abandoned when the operation closed. Crates and barrels were stacked against one wall, and several rough benches provided seating around what had clearly been a central gathering area for the miners. This was the main staging area, Oliver explained, setting the lantern on a flat rock that served as a table. The actual ore shafts branch off further in, but they're not safe since the collapse. We should stay here. Abigail sank gratefully onto one of the benches, her face pale with exhaustion and pain. The journey had clearly taxed her healing wound, though she made no complaint. Maggie set Hannah down, and the child immediately began exploring the unfamiliar space with cautious curiosity, staying within the circle of lantern light. "We should block the entrance," Thad suggested, scanning the chamber for materials. "Create a choke point if they decide to follow us in." Oliver nodded, already moving toward a stack of timber supports. "These were meant for reinforcing the deeper shafts," he explained. "We can use them to create a partial barricade, narrow the access point." Working together, Thad and Oliver constructed a simple but effective barrier across 2/3 of the tunnel, leaving just enough space for single-file passage. Behind this, they positioned several ore carts to provide additional cover if shooting began. "Not perfect," Thad acknowledged when they had finished, "but it will slow them down and give us a defensive position." Maggie had been busy as well, using the supplies Mrs. Chen had provided to create a more comfortable space for Hannah and Abigail. Blankets were spread on the driest part of the stone floor, food arranged for easy access, and a small oil stove, part of the miners' abandoned equipment, coaxed into providing modest heat. "How long will we need to stay here?" she asked as Thad joined them, his face grim with concentration. "Until the marshal arrives," he replied. "Sometime tomorrow evening, according to Jenkins. We have supplies enough until then, and this position is defensible." "Unless they decide to smoke us out," Abigail pointed out pragmatically. "Or collapse the entrance." Oliver shook his head firmly. "They won't risk that. The Fletcher mine is technically still owned by the Northern Pacific Mining Company. Damaging it would bring corporate lawyers down on Parker faster than any federal marshal." This practical assessment provided some reassurance, though Thad remained vigilant, positioning himself near their makeshift barricade with his rifle ready. The sounds of pursuit had faded entirely. Either their hunters had lost the trail in the snow, or they were regrouping for a more organized approach. Hours passed in tense waiting. Hannah eventually fell asleep on the blankets curled beside Abigail, who had succumbed to exhaustion despite her efforts to remain alert. Oliver maintained a position near Thad, a mining pick in his hands, serving as an improvised weapon, his young face set in lines of determination that aged him beyond his years. Maggie moved between checking on Hannah and joining Thad at his post, her presence a comfort neither acknowledged verbally, but both felt deeply. During one such moment, as the night deepened toward the early hours of morning, she spoke softly to avoid waking the others. "We never finished our conversation," she observed, "about what happens after." Thad glanced at her, surprised she would return to such a personal topic in their current circumstances. "Perhaps not the best time," he suggested gently. "Or perhaps the perfect time," Maggie countered. "When else are we guaranteed such privacy, such focus on what truly matters?" She smiled slightly at his expression. "Danger has a way of clarifying priorities, doesn't it?" Thad couldn't argue with that assessment. The imminent threat had indeed stripped away pretense and hesitation, leaving only essential truths. "You said Hannah had grown attached to me," he recalled. "As had you." "Yes." Maggie's directness remained refreshing even now. "The question is, what do you feel in return? And what would you want if we survive this and have choices again?" Thad considered his answer carefully, aware of its significance for all their futures. "I feel more alive than I have since before the war," he admitted finally. "You and Hannah, you've reminded me that there's more to life than enduring, than atoning for perceived failures. You've given me purpose again, and not just because of my promise to Daniel." He paused, gathering courage for what needed to be said. "If we survive this, if we have choices again, I would choose to be part of your lives, in whatever capacity you would allow." Maggie's eyes reflecting the lantern light held his steadily. "And if that capacity were as husband, as father to Hannah." The directness of the question startled him, though perhaps it shouldn't have. Maggie Sinclair had never been one to approach important matters indirectly. "I would consider it the greatest honor of my life," Thad replied with equal directness, his voice rough with emotion. "But you should know I'm not whole Maggie. Not just the leg, but inside. The war, the trial, the years alone, they've left marks that may never fully heal." "None of us are whole," Maggie said softly. "We all carry damage visible or hidden. The question isn't whether we're perfect. It's whether we're willing to help each other carry the broken pieces." She reached out her hand, finding his in the dim light. "I am, if you are." Thad's fingers closed around hers, the simple contact more.